Okay, okay. Hello, hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well. Let's see. So, hello, hello. As you can see, I have a new chair because my chair literally broke down and I had to get a new one as quickly as possible so that I could stream. So I decided to get one of the why do I, not new, but like one of the I guess gamer chairs, I guess, that they have. I mean, even though I'm not exactly known for my um, ability, right, when it comes to uh, video games, I actually liked it because it seems rather comfortable, at least in my opinion. So I thought that that would be, you know, yes, 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 yes. My chair stream, yes, exactly. Instead of an Airstream, it's a chair stream, right? That's why I got it in Chrome. No, but uh, anyway. So for today, what I wanted us to do was to actually get through. Well, here, let me actually add this a title. Is to for us to try to get through uh, Giga Chad's video, the one on traditionalism, because that's always fun. I don't know. I think that his videos are so fascinating. So anyway, that's what we're gonna do for right now, because definitely as more people start making their way in. Um, Hooray! Right, right.
Of Evila's book of Meditations on the Peaks. Now, Meditations on the Peaks is another book I'm currently reading about four different books, so I'm jumping in between a lot. But Meditations on the Peaks, it's a beautiful
But the best advice that I can give, right? And so like this is why I'm saying, like, there's no way he's reading four books, right? The reasoning why is because one, you shouldn't be, right? Like, there's no way you're going to be able to like get what's going on if you are reading four books. But it's important not to hopscotch your books. Like, this is something that, as someone that went through, many years of education, right, post-secondary education, I can tell you the best thing to do is to read one book at a time and to just get through them. And I know most people are going to be like, oh, but I want to read. So trust me, I know this. I have ADHD too. I know how difficult it is. Trust me. It's the hardest thing, right, sometimes to do. But um, it is something that needs to be done, right? Like, you cannot be hopscotching the books that you're reading. So to hear that he's reading four books, in essence, means that he's not reading any of them, right? Because that's what ends up happening when you hopscotch books, right? Is that you end up not reading any of them, and that's not what you want, right? Obviously, the reason why you have so many books, the reason why you have so many things that you want to devote your attention to, is because you want to gain all of the knowledge, right? Gain all of the interaction that you would otherwise have, right? But if you hopscotch, the chances of that actually coming to fruition are very, very low. So again, my advice is, do not hopscotch books. Just, I know it's hard, but it's the best way to do it, right? Especially if you are like getting a degree right now, the best thing you can do is to sit down, get the reading done, move on to the next one. As hard as that might be, that's the only way that you can really get through those things, right? You cannot read four things at a time. That's just not going to happen. Thank you. Thank you so much. I cannot believe it's already been a year. I never expected to be a streamer. I mean, even saying it like that is like, oh, because I kind of, but I'm glad that people like learning about history and learning about especially bad. Oh, huh, weird. Okay.
Reflection on the power that can be found in nature, and how one of the best ways to tap into that primordial tradition is to mountain climb. And really, I see it more as physical exertion coupled with immersion in nature. The marriage is something I use a lot because in my own personal philosophy, it's the foundation of society, both between the masculine and the feminine, and
So I'm obviously going to be pause champing this quite a bit, but I do, as I usually do. One thing is, marriage as we understand it now is a medieval institution. So this like, oh, it existed back in all perpetuity. It's like the modern institution of marriage, right? Which is known to be outdated. In fact, the people who were the biggest critics of the institution of marriage were like the liberal reformers, that were the bourgeoisie, right? During like the French Revolution, right? Because so like the fact that it's become something else over the centuries is, hello Anton, welcome in, welcome in. But as for like actual substantive, it's going great, thank you. However, as for actual substantive analysis here, saying that marriage is one, the union of the masculine and the feminine, is again him reading history through the present, right? That is, that he is reading it as though how we see masculinity and femininity, how we see marriage now, is the way how it's always been. And we know that this isn't the case. Like, we know this wasn't even the case even in the beginning, during most of the Middle Ages, right? It wasn't until the High Middle Ages and until the Late Middle Ages that we get essentially what we now understand to be like marriage as concept, right? But even then, like, what a marriage was supposed to represent, was not as finite. Definitely in the 19th century is where marriage as we understand it now, right, with the nuclear family, became, anything resembling. Yeah, it's not set in stone. And we know this even from people that lived in the 19th century, right? That like even they themselves critiqued on how like, oh, how marriage has changed even within their own lifetimes being within the 19th century, right? So again, so this whole thing trying to like, oh, well, it's this ancient thing that goes back. I mean, it kind of makes me think of like, I don't know, like if people have ever read the book like The Da Vinci Code, but like like the whole like the Grail and all of that stuff, and he's like, oh yes, it's all supposed to be this like masculine slash feminine imagery and blah blah blah. It's very that, right? It's like, see, it's like, okay, like yeah, you can read that in there, sure, fine, but it's just like, I remember my parents saying that European folks get married willy-nilly, and that they, Vietnamese people, choose spouses so carefully their parents do it. Western, I mean, like, that's very similar to like when I was growing up, like when I was still a Hasidic Jew, we like the idea of like secular marriage, right, is just like not even a thing, right? Like in the sense that like one big difference though is Jewish people have always been able to get divorced, and it can be done by either party. Either party can do that. However, and also, well, I'm not going to get into all the details, but we had arranged marriages, right? Oh, and but by arranged, I think people often have like because so many things have been called arranged marriage, right? That now people think like all these things that are like forced marriages are the same thing as arranged marriages, right? Um, so instead, what we have is a shadchan, right, which is a matchmaker, and the matchmaker does not have to be like. A lot of times they are women, like wives of rabbis, but they don't have to be. I mean, like the shadchan in when the yeshiva I went to, by definition, was a dude. It was a rabbi, right? And they just like knew everything about your family. They kind of knew more or less. Like, are you a good Torah scholar? Are you like, what are your interests? Are you stuff like that, right? Your parents, all of that. Your parents also have a lot of input into that as well. And then it's to, then you go and have like these supervised dates essentially, right? Where it's not like regular dates, right? It's like you go to like a coffee shop or to a hotel lobby, which is very common as well. It's very common in Israel to do that, but that's because they have like the servers, right? And yeah, like you just sit there and talk, right? It's like, this is who we think you're most compatible with. Meet them. If you like them, then we'll consider, right? It isn't you by yourself trying to make that determination only. But this isn't me being like, oh yeah, it's the only way to go about it. No, obviously not. Marriage in the secular terms is new. Yeah, like the whole thing of like romantic love is completely a modern thing. Um, like the concept that existed during the Middle Ages. Well, when I say the Middle Ages, I'm talking about the European Middle Ages, and particularly the Western European Middle Ages, including Germany and Poland as well. However, would be the idea of amor. Now the word amor in Spanish means love, right? But what amor meant back then meant something spiritual. It did not have to do with the physical. In fact, it was a reaction, right? It was a response to the classical period where their primary concern, and again, when I say this, it's not like, oh, this was it, since 6,000 years ago until the year 400, but more or less, right? Like when we think of like the high classical era, right, of Greece and Rome, particularly Rome is what we're talking about, was that they had eros, right? Like in ancient Greece and Rome, that they had the concept of eros, right? Where we get things like the term erotic, right? But it doesn't mean erotic as it means now, right? Like now that term means something very specific. Back then, it instead meant something, much completely different. It's like platonic love. Yeah, like the whole point was that you were fulfilling a sacrament, right? That was supposed to ensure your place in heaven, right? Like it was done in a religious context, right? And that's because everything was done in a religious context. So yeah, like so the whole and the romantic love as we know it now, right, is really like even the 19th century version is completely like we've gone so beyond that, right? Like we've taken it to a whole different level, which is it just shows that with changing material conditions, right, the base and the superstructure change, right? Like it's a very good example of that, where like now we have people, right, where it's like you go back a few decades and in the Western world, like the idea of polyamory or even the idea of, you know what I mean, like anything outside of very strict monogamy, blah blah blah, right? Like all of these things would have been unthinkable, right? It definitely would have been seen as negative, right? Um, but again, that's another thing. And yeah, so yeah, that's a good way of thinking as platonic love, right? But again, it's because like what love is dependent on so many other factors, just like attraction, right? Like if you're ace, like me, right? Like you don't necessarily like look at someone and they're like, oh, they're hot and blah blah blah, right? Like you don't feel that, right? I don't. But you can be aesthetically attracted to someone. You can say, oh, they're very beautiful, right? But that doesn't mean that you know what I mean? Like anyway, I hope that makes sense. Uh,
between all other forces. Again, when I publish my magnum opus, I'm sure you'll hear about that.
I like using Greek words for love solely because loving my mom, like loving pizza, is very different. No, yeah. I mean, like, again, like, this is why, like, using these terms as though they've always, it's interesting you say that because that proves the point, right? Like, that goes to what we were just discussing, right? Is that, like, the category, right, that now we use this label for eros and for amor and for liebe or luve or love, right? It's like those things have changed over time, right? Um, and so like we would not say, right, like it in the same way how like in Spanish, right? Like you can say me gusta pizza, right? And you can I like pizza, but like you would, there are so many ways to say, oh, that I love you, right? Like adore or to, blah blah blah. There's all these different words, right? Because they're reflective of these shifting. I mean, and that's why we have such a long vocabulary to describe these things, right? Because obviously there are so many different forms of love, right? So
Of society, both between the masculine and the feminine, and between all other forces. Again, when I publish my magnum opus, I'm sure you'll hear about that. But, that kind of marriage between natural appreciation and physical exertion is the beauty of it. Again, very much like the path of the warrior. And King Charles has, his environmentalism is very reminiscent of it, almost uncannily so. And I agree with much of what King Charles says about environmentalism. His latching on to alternative forms of medicine is another thing that he has directly linked to the traditionalist philosophers, to traditionalist thought, and which is something one of the reasons why I have a lot more hope for King Charles than a lot of other people would. And one big thing people
okay, like this is the problem with the whole like King Charles thing, right? Is like, yes, he is the king of the United Kingdom, blah blah blah, whatever, right? But it's like it's not like he can do anything. Like it's not like he has any temporal power, right? And another thing too is the idea of like what he's counting as alternative medicine can mean different things to different people, right? Like there are some people, right, who consider indigenous, right, knowledges about medicine, right, to be alternative, but they're only alternative in the Western, right, understanding of what is and is not medicine. But to say that the King of England is like, oh well, he's an environmentalist because, you know, he might have said some, sussy things about, whatever, is like, well, it depends what you mean, right? Because it's not as though he's saying we should empower, right, indigenous peoples from around the world and colonized peoples, right, to bring their knowledges and try to employ them. No, it's he gets to have the best healthcare in the world and gets to do whatever he wants, right? Yeah, I'm confused how King Charles connects alternative medicine and yeah, it is, yeah. alternative medicine is contextual. Eagle balm for Vietnamese people is a cure all. Anything and anything else is alternative. I mean, it's kind of like there are things that I grew up with, like arnica, right? Like something that like I grew up, it's like, oh, if you get hurt, you put some arnica on it. Or oh, like if you have this, you boil a tea of this and use it in this way. um but even things that are like like aloe vera, right? Hello, it's the Morton, welcome in, welcome in. Like there's always been this desire to either colonize, right, whatever western or whatever western medicine. I'm doing great, Morton, how about yourself? And then to exclude everything else, right, and to demonize it in many ways, right? It's not just a question of like denigrating it, right, and viewing it as lesser than, but it's like an active, right, trying to say that, oh no, yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like not bad. Awesome, awesome. Well, that's good to hear, Morton. That's good to hear. So like that's why it's kind of like, cuz like in Mexico, for example, like we have all of these different herbs and everything that we have used for thousands of years, right? Like this is something that and there were instances where in the colonial period, the Spaniards were like, "Oh no, like we like, we will imprison people and do worse, right? For people if they continue to practice indigenous medicine." But then like things got so bad, right, that then they had to use it, and then it worked, and then they're like, "Oh well, look, our scientists discovered these plants that do these." You know what I mean? So it's like it's also that too, right? Like so there's a lot of that, but I don't know, like it's we will imprison people. Yeah, no, I'm not even joking. Like yes, they were like, oh, like we don't know what's in that tea, and I'm like literally they're saying, oh, this tea will help you, cure whatever, right? Like whatever it might be, right? Because it's kind of like those like apothecaries, right, where it's like they have all the different dried things and then they put it together in like a little satchel, or a little sachet, I should say, and then they're like, oh, boil this in water, 2 times a day for a week or whatever, right? It's like we have a similar cultural heritage that has that too. But like initially, Western people are very hostile to it, right? Until somehow they miraculously discovered that it works, right? And I'm not saying it all works. I'm not saying any of that, but it's kind of weird to like, but King Charles, right? Like he is talking about the good alternative medicine, right? Which is like, is it actually alternative medicine, or is it like the sussy things that people did during the pandemic, right? Like you know what I mean? Because that's also alternative medicine because you're using it beyond the purpose of what it was meant to be used for. I'm not going to name the substance, right? So yeah, 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 yeah. So
People refuse to acknowledge is traditionalism, and the philosophy of Julius Evola even has been quite impactful in the British aristocracy since its inception. I mean, like for example, I want to bring in Prince Philip. I love Prince Philip, wholly based, but he once said, if I could become, a disease, I would want to become one and wipe out half the world. It's almost like billions must die, the West has fallen. But aristocrat disease, I mean, like for example, I want to bring in Prince Philip. I love Prince Philip, wholly based, but he once said, if I could become, a disease, I would want to become one and wipe out half the world. It's almost like billions must die, the West has fallen. But aristocrats obviously, latch on.
okay, so all I have to say is, that's a really weird thing to say. Yeah, like that's not a Freudian slip. Like he intended to say that. A Freudian fall. Yeah, exactly. Um but yeah, that is kind of strange to be like, ah, yes, what I want, like, if I were to become a disease, I would want to be one that does, that. And I'm like, well, actually, if you think about it, you know, colonizers kind of have, what I mean, like, like colonization, kind of has caused a lot of harm. So, you kind of already were one, Philip. But, JK, JK. Well, right, like the whole thing is to not like with viruses, it's like, or with different things, right? It's like to not necessarily kill the host species, this host species, right? Um, so that's why, like, when things are not intended for a specific species, and it passes on to another one, like that's why, like it will result in casualties on when it comes to that, right? Or fatalities, I should say. But yeah, like saying that is just ridiculous. Also, another thing too is like Prince Philip is became a member of the British aristocracy. I mean, I know this is a dumb point because they're all like related anyway. I mean, like they're literally like Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were like second cousins or whatever. But regardless of that, he's like Greek, like he's from the Greek royal family and from the Danish royal family too. But like his family was like back when the Greece still had a monarchy, right before the Second World War. He was part of that royal family. Again, not that it matters, but it's just a weird thing to be like the English aristocracy says someone who historically isn't even part of it, who married into it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, that's such a weird thing. 'Cause it's like, well, colonialism did actually do what he said he wanted to do. Like white supremacy did do what he said he wanted to do as a disease. Like that actually does that all the time. And it's like it's such a and it's one of those things where people refuse to diagnose, right? Like they will deny the diagnosis even though, right, all of the patient is, sort of, I mean, I don't want to draw out the metaphor too much, but I think you understand what I'm trying to get at, right? It's like to say that one is just disturbing, but like colonialism, white supremacy, all of that stuff actually, I wonder what makes Philip based. He is barely relevant. I mean, he's dead too. I mean, he's already dead. But like what made him based is apparently the fact that he said that if he could be a disease, that he would, or that he would want to be one that wipes out like half the people on the planet. That's why I'm saying, like, well, settler colonialism, European colonialism, white supremacy, like all of that stuff already has done that and continues to do more harm. Hello, Engels. The person in this video, GigaChad, claims that traditionalism makes him cool or something. Yeah, exactly, right? That he's like, oh, because he's part of this like aristocracy, right? And I'm just like, well, one, he said the English aristocracy, which he wasn't, like for most of his life until he married Elizabeth. He was part of the Greek aristocracy and I guess the Danish one. But like, I don't know. It's just such a weird point. Like, it also shows that he doesn't really know much about Philip. Like, I mean, like imagine saying that wholly based because it's like, I mean, as to quote him, right? Billions must die. The West has fallen, right? Like, imagine calling that base. Like, that's just, I don't know.
Onto this philosophy. I myself do.
Oh, you do? Can you put it in stream suggestions on Discord? That would be best for me because then that way I can just pull it up really quick.
The aristocratic class of Europe, and especially the United Kingdom, who preserve their aristocracy, one of the reasons why I love it, is very receptive to.
That's weird to say that the British preserve their aristocracy. because one of the things that hello Moni, hello, welcome in, welcome in. Uh it's strange to hear someone say that because one of the biggest complaints in the 19th century, particularly the earlier part of the 19th century, was that the aristocracy was not being preserved, right? That like actually, and in fact there are multiple novels that talk about this, like that are seen as very impactful in literary and, history. And that is the fact that like even in Jane Austen, this is in Sense and Sensibility, I believe, and also in Mansfield Park, where the big complaint is the fact that the bourgeoisie, right, are able to buy their way into the aristocracy, right? And that's why there is a big complaint about the army, right, about the armed forces, right, that they don't like it that now they're allowing, the bourgeoisie as opposed to the aristocracy, right, become members of the like essentially rise to the rank of the highest officers, which before was only reserved for the aristocracy, and that's allowing them, right, to marry people and gain entrance into society they otherwise wouldn't have. Like that was a huge issue, and this even goes until like the 20th century, like with something of like E.M. Forster's Howard's End. Like that whole book is about how there's like the real aristocracy, and then there's the fake aristocracy that's like just money, right? It's like, also it's actually funny you say that because ironically, I mean, like it has, right? Like I mean, it's preserved, in one sense. It has definitely like preserved, like, that distinction, right? And it has kind of like, and the bourgeoisie always wanted to recreate it, right? It just wanted itself to be the aristocracy, right? um I'm talking to, but if we look at it in more of a like a yeah, but I'm thinking of it in like a historical materialist way, right? Like the medieval aristocracy, right? Technically, right? That there's nothing that resembles that now. But in terms of like, yes, like having a power structure that essentially functions like the aristocracy. Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you, Holy Lazy Duck. Totally agree.
This because what it fundamentally preaches is that instead of relying on capitalism and socialism, both false gods, capitalism, it just pits people against each other, and it does not reward the higher man. In fact, it rewards the man who lowers his morals and lowers his value.
Thank you so much, good for Gabby. Thank you so much for the tier 1 sub. I really appreciate it. And thank you for getting us started on today's sub goal. I really appreciate it too.
More. What Evola, what he preaches is really medieval because he sees the medieval period as a golden age. He rewards physical strength, and he thinks greatness, like really the control of land and being able to protect that land by being stronger than everyone else, both mentally and physically, is the ideal way to have a society organized. It's all it.
Okay, this person does not know anything about the Middle Ages because that is not how feudalism worked. Like I like how people think that somehow that like, yes, back in the day all of the knights were totally all like literal, like, giga chads walking around the earth, right? And that like they never did anything that we would do now, right? Like and also saying that that's the best way. Samurais, medieval period as a golden age. I thought the narrative that the medieval period was a bad time with diseases and stuff. Like, this is contrary to some other right wing narratives. Well, yeah, because it's contradictory to a lot of the right wing narratives that sprung, particularly historically speaking, in Protestant countries, right? Because that's where like a lot of them start off with things like the Black Legend, right, which is about Spain, right? So it's this view negatively of Catholicism, but traditional Catholics, they view the Middle Ages, right, which was the height, right, of the church's power, right, of of the church at Rome's power, as being this golden age, right, because everything was, like whatever the Pope said went, right, you know what I mean, to the point where for the first 500 years, right, of the Middle Ages, right? Like in the lead up to the Great Schism between the Eastern churches and the Western churches, rather the Western Church, I should say, was this idea that Rome had this like first seat at the table, right? And that because of that too, right? Like all of the bishoprics, all of the everything that existed, because if you go to the Eastern Roman Empire, right, there are like lots of jurisdictions, right, lots of different patriarchal sees, right, as they're called, right, which just means like the seat of a patriarch, right, like in Jerusalem and in Antioch, which is actually now in Damascus, Byzantium, Constantinople, now Istanbul, et cetera, right. In the Western Empire, there was just one, and that was Rome. So it gave them much outsized power. And so when the schism happens, right, that's the reason why the schism is able to take like half of the empire with it, right, or at least half of the area of the what used to be the empire, is because it was already under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome, and the Patriarch technically. Of Rome, which used to be the same thing. Now, it's important to note, though, that seeing it as a golden age does, again, speak to the fact that he must be in rather right-wing Catholic circles, because if that is, because it also does run counter to certain narratives, right? One of them is that the Middle Ages, right, was not when somehow the church was more united. That isn't true. Historically speaking, that isn't true, right? Because up until the year 1098, there were all these different overlapping jurisdictions, right, around the entire, the areas where Christians lived, right? But also, there was not a standard liturgy, right, or a standard mass even until after the Protestant Reformation, right? Like what traditional Catholics love, right? Like the traditional Latin mass is not actually an old thing. It doesn't go back to the days of Jesus. It doesn't go back to the days of the early church. It doesn't even go back to the days of the East and West split. No, it goes back to after the Protestant Reformation. So it was in response to it that they made the Tridentine Mass that they hold as being traditional. So this also runs into some, narrative problems, right? Like, how can this be a golden age if it also was before, right? You had the idea of, the ideas of Vatican I, right? Like papal infallibility, blah blah blah, all these other things, right? You know what I mean? Like it kind of like, but it makes sense to them because they would be like, oh well, of course we would have those things, but because at the end of the day, it's about power, right? It's about, they want a world that where the church, right, the institution that they think should give them power, should have ultimate power, right? So
it's really almost feudalist ideals, the ideals of a classic European knight. Another reason why I really like it. And the English aristocracy are very receptive to this, because recently the English aristocracy has pretty much set themselves apart and kind of detached from society because they're so disappointed on what it's become. They're losing their prestige to bourgeois opportunists who are simply raising themselves.
Okay, this is hilarious because I just talked about this in the context of the early 19th century, right, and also the late 18th century. This is like he's literally rehashing something that already happened Like, I know, yeah, I just talked about this. I just talked about this. Like, literally. Like, he's acting like now it's just started to this day. It's like, no, no, no. This has been happening for over 200 years. Like, I mean, really, since over, almost 500 years. I don't know what you're talking about, right? Like, uh, oh gosh, that's so funny. I like how he uses Jeff Bezos as if Jeff Bezos has become a member of the British aristocracy, which last time I checked, he wasn't. Like, I don't know, maybe things have changed. Maybe he became the Duke of, I don't know, something. Hi Tivold, welcome in, welcome in. Like, I don't know if he was given, like, I don't know, like the Earl of Amazon or something. I don't know, but yeah, like I literally just talked about this, and he's like getting it all wrong. Like, he's like, no, this isn't. And the fact that he's saying that the current British aristocracy has feudal ideals is just completely just in, like, no, what are you talking about? Like, like the notion of property as we know it is something that we ended the Middle Ages, right? Like the Enclosure Acts happened at the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period, also known as the Renaissance, right? And that's when you have the enclosing of the land, that became, right, like the estates of the aristocracy. So, like, again, historically speaking, this just doesn't make any sense because, yeah, it just everything's wrong. But also, it's so funny to say that the British aristocracy is like disappointed in the masses, I guess, to where it distances itself from them. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like literally, like the aristocracy is like a tourist attraction in England. Like you know what I mean? It's like they're all about being celeb. I mean, they are really like they have their own magazines about them. You know what I mean? Like, so to be like, oh, they have nothing to do with those bourgeois things. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, okay.
By making more money, by simply exploiting others, and have no real, thoughts to the higher. Just like Nietzsche said, and really, unlike the other traditionalist philosophers, perennialists, I should say, because Evola and the perennialists, I do see a fundamental divide. Evola constantly mentions Nietzsche. Much of Ride the Tiger is devoted to Nietzsche. And fundamentally, these aristocratic ideals of having this higher class that can fully devote themselves to understanding the primordial tradition and coming to terms with that and understanding it and creating art that taps into it and beauty through physical strength and masculine power.
I just remembered that, like, in this video, he keeps saying tapping in and tapping, like, bruh, like, okay, like, this is why people have, like, Grinder and all of that stuff, Tinder, like, if that's what you need, like, go right ahead. And we also support our sex workers as well. Like, you don't have to keep, like, dropping. I mean, I don't know. These aren't even hints at this point, but regardless, um, there's just something, I don't know, right here. Like, it's interesting too because Nietzsche wasn't an aristocrat, right? Like, when he's talking about the the aristocracy, and he's talking about it. Well, he's talking about it, one, in the context of the ancient Greeks, right? Like, he didn't think the aristocracy in his own time was great, which goes against what GigaChat is trying to say, because, well, many reasons. But another thing too is, like, only the aristocracy can make art, right? Like, true art, right? I mean, that's just like even historically speaking, that's just not true. Like, court painters almost, like, hardly ever were born into the aristocracy. Like, they are like they almost exclusively came from what was called the middling sort in the early modern period, which is what became which were the artisans, right, the merchants, etc., they became the bourgeoisie, right, the bourgeoisie and the petit bourgeoisie. So already like this whole thing that like, oh, aristocrats can see through the veil of whatever is just nonsensical. But also another thing too is like, um, I don't think that constantly referencing Nietzsche really adds anything. Because again, not only was Nietzsche not an aristocrat, but like he is part of this long tradition, including GigaChad, including many people, right wing people, that think that somehow if they were to install, right, this new aristocracy, right, that they would recognize him, right, as being one of their big special boys and being a long lost member of the aristocracy, right? That's at the heart of all of those things, right? Like Nietzsche says the same things that you know that people say about the Democrats, uh, and like the left right now. Nietzsche said that back then in the 19th century. I'm not even joking. Second half of Human, All Too Human, it's all there, right? Like literally every talking point just comes from that. But it was this view that like, oh well, I mean, it literally is like I am able to decipher, the sacred texts, and so that is my invitation into the club, right? But that's not how it works, right? Like, no, like the actual aristocracy, like you would be a petit bourgeois interloper, right, to the aristocracy, right? Like that's the problem with trying to install this as a overarching thing, right? It's like it just does not work.
And all this, virile energy and all this cool stuff. But this is, yeah, the aristocracy is receptive to this, and many other people are. For example, in Russia, traditionalism has, gone wild, especially because of Alexander Dugin. Now, Dugin, I have obvious issues with for a lot of his philosophy, and really, he's a watered down public intellectual. He tries to equate himself with Evola. He's not that cool. Evola was a dangerous mystic. You know,
Like, I mean, Evola. I mean, like like if there is a person that is most like Evola, it actually is Dugan, because that's literally what Evola was. He's this person that's like, I am so based, I am so hyper based that like even fascism isn't based enough for me, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like that's literally it, right? Like it's always like, oh well, you know, like I'm not saying that his comparison to him, say, I mean, even intellectually, I mean, the difference between, you know, Alexander Dugin and Giulio Evola, right, are two different things, right? Like Julius Evola started off being a an academic, well, a sort of like sort of like well, a scholar through his own work, right, on Hermeticism and magic, right? Like that's where he started off. Then all the other stuff started coming out, right? Not that it wasn't there already, because that's why when people want to start bringing up like Hermeticism and magic and all of that stuff, but like the deep stuff, right? Like the deep stuff that has like a history, I always get very worried as a historian, because I know where that usually leads to, right? Like it always, like somehow Madame Blavatsky gets brought in somehow, and it's just like, why, right? But like if, I mean, comparatively speaking, like the profile that Dugin has in comparison to Vladimir Putin, right? And that Evola had in relation to Benito Mussolini, right, are is about the same. I mean, you know what I mean? Like obviously it's I'm not going to say that he was the Dugin of his time, but in a way he kind of was, in many ways, because I mean, like, then afterwards he's just like, see, like, the problem with fascism was that it was too progressive. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Like, that's what to me makes me think that trying to, like, like, calling him a watered down public intellectual, fine, but I feel like if we would have been alive during the time that Julius Evola was himself a public intellectual, right, that he probably would have had the same complaint, right, and he would have said, Oswald Spengler only, or someone before that, right, because that's just how it always happens, right? Like, the intellectuals of now, quote unquote, right? Intellectuals in quotes, right? Are always, seen in this very similar way, right? So I'll just tack it up to that. I don't know.
In the words of Hermann Hesse, another very well-respected writer that I personally have read quite a bit of, he called him a dazzling and interesting but very dangerous author, and that is exactly what Evola is. What Evola preaches about how degraded modern society is, and how we're really living in probably, mentally the worst time for humans. However, I certainly think that the modern traditionalists, and I'm talking about, men like myself, who have decided to pursue physical fitness and intellectualism, but have managed to set themselves apart from the world and almost detach while still functioning within it. That's exactly what Evola preaches. And lastly, we have Steve Bannon, who was a former very, very close ally of Trump. And now you can find a score of articles all about, Steve Bannon, he quoted Evola, he's an evil fascist, he's a Nazi, he's trying to turn the world into this fascist mess, and an accelerationist. Steve Bannon is a bit of a nutcase, I'm not going to deny that. But also, just because he reads a bit of Evola, and I think Steve Bannon misunderstands a lot of Evola, to be frank, but just because he reads Evola, and reading Evola does not make...
Okay, I just have to say this, like, a person that hasn't read Evola, right, that actually said it in this video, right, that he hasn't actually, like, read much, through Evola's work, and to be like, see, the thing is that you just don't get it, like, it's like he's doing the meme thing, right? Like, he's literally the meme here, because, like, to say, I mean, this is why I said, like, sure, like, if you want to compare to Dugin, fine, whatever, we can do that, but to Steve, it's like, yeah, people who constantly are name dropping Evola tend to be fascists. I don't know any communists that are, like, really big into Evola, that are actual communists, right? Those two things are, like, don't mix, right? Like, those, like someone who said that fascism was too progressive, and someone that says communism is good, they tend not to agree. Like, they tend not to, I don't know, get along, so to speak. But also to be like, oh, you have the wrong interpretation. I mean, that's just, I mean, to me, that's a worthless endeavor, just in general, because how, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, obviously someone who is a well-known propagandist, right, like Steve Bannon, is going to use Evola to his advantage, right? That's what he does, right? Like, that's like saying, oh, but if you're going to use the based thinkers, then you have to be fully honest in how you use them. Like, no. The fact that he's read Evola, right, is, and uses Evola, is what gives the game away, right? But for someone that, again, hasn't read through Evola, and is also here saying that they themselves have picked up these virile aspects, right, of being like a knight, which, by the way, knights were not the people that owned all of the land. That was the feudal lords. The feudal lords had knights to defend their land. the lords did not defend their own land like themselves. Like he's not even he doesn't even understand the structure of feudalism. It seems, but you know, that's like, does it really matter? Like on one point, yes, right? Because I do want historical accuracy for someone that's claiming that like we should reinstate this system, which would just be horrific because for the vast majority of history, at which I'm proud to be, to say, I should, note is like we have just been peasants. Like the vast majority of humanity has been landless peasants. And that is not something to be ashamed of. In fact, that's something to be proud because that means that something like Marxism, socialism, communism is something that is a part of us, right? It's part of our world, and so instead to be like, oh yes, well I want to be like a knight. Well, I mean, in many cases, knighthoods were not even passed down hereditarily, right? So this idea of the aristocracy being through blood is not necessarily true. There were many cases where, and this is actually true in Spain, right, where you would get comprabanza or probanza de nobleza, right, or nobleza de sangre, right, nobility of blood, but that wouldn't last for eternity, right? It would only last until they didn't need you anymore. Essentially. So like if it lasted one generation, it only lasted one generation. So again, looking at the historical record and putting his ideas against them, it's like even they do not agree with what he's saying. Because knights did not rule over the land. They were the people who worked for the feudal lord who owned the land. They were just given, whatever, their own lands to govern underneath them, right? Like essentially they were like supervisors, but lords were the, district manager, right? So to speak. So yeah, so like, and then this whole thing about like virility is like, I don't know. Didn't the feudal lord get permission to govern? Yeah, and that too, right? Like, and that's also like another thing is like the highest lord of the land, right, is the king, right? It's like the king, yeah, because a lord of lords is a king, and a king of kings is an emperor, right? So legally, the land is the king's. Yes, completely true. Firebird MS, yes, completely true. So yes. The feudal lord only gets a barony or a dukedom or whatever it is at the behest of a king. And even then, and a king of kings is God. Or if you live in the Middle East, it's the Shah, Yeah. Melech HaMelechim, I suppose, yeah. No, yeah, for sure. No, yeah, like that is a common thing that I mean, like that's why I said like King of Kings, Lord of Lords, because that's something that is Melechim. Yeah. Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. Melechai, yeah. But yes, that is precisely the point that I'm getting at, right? Is like, is that the Hashem is considered the king of kings of all of the kings, right? But also like the idea of like the Shah, right? The king of kings or the Shah of Shahs, right? Yeah, gotta one up Cyrus. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, because you have like Shahashah or Shaheshah, depending on the pronunciation. Also like Shaheshadr historically, but that's a whole different thing. I'm not going to get into that right now. I don't want to get into the ins and outs of Middle Persian. But But yes, so yes, that is precisely what I'm talking about. It's like the king is the one that gives out these titles to people, and also the king can take them away, right? So it's only people lower than, right, in nobility than you, right, that you can affect in that way. So like, so his belief that like, oh, like he will give birth to a son who is a knight, that's not how that works. Like movies in America from Hollywood love to portray that ah yes, I am the son of the blah blah blah. Although that's uh a, although that's Acadian de facto is different. Oh, although that's all de jure de facto is different. Yeah, yeah, exactly, right. Um, right, but what I'm referring to is like from the historical record, like, and I'm using particularly Spain, where like the concept of blood purity, right, like these things that were used against Jewish people. I mean, against like historically against like I'm a Sephardi, so like uh, against my ancestors, right? To say that even if like it didn't even matter if you converted, right? So, but in a similar concept to this, which is part of the primordial origins of modern day race, but it's not the same thing, is the belief that things are transmitted through the blood, right? And so one of those things was nobleza de sangre, and that's what he's getting wrong. Is he's thinking that it was like for all in all eternity, knights are always granted these titles, or and it's not true. Like there are many things. God, I hope Isabel and her husband are rotting in hell. Well, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. Yeah, though we don't really. Yeah, I was about to say I don't know because we don't really have a. But I know what you mean. I know what you mean, and I know that you mean it metaphorically as well. Of course, of course. But but yeah. What's so interesting is it's actually interesting because um there is I've read some articles that talk about this more at length, but the fact that Ferdinand himself was the descendant of well, like two generations down, but was of a Jewish converso family as well. So, but again, neither here nor there. Like I think to me that like dwelling over that is just again it's this is like it's us conceptualizing the past through how we think of the past, how we think of Jewishness now. So yeah, it's not surprising. Like we constantly, well, I mean, I get what you're trying to say. I get what you're trying to say by that. But I don't want to be too literal with that, right? Because then that, you know what I mean? Because then that sounds like the victims are to blame. You know what I mean? That's just the one thing I would say. But I get what you're going for, right? But I would say that, like whether or not it's absolutely true, I mean, I can't tell you. The chances that it's true are very high because Spain has Spain has uh, been under multi-ethnic rule much longer than it ever was under the like limpieza de sangre, like Spanish Catholic rule that it's had since 1492, right? So again, it's kind of with the Islamic golden, yeah, as well as like prior things like during even in the Visigothic era, it wasn't as segregated and as intolerant as it became after, so. And yes, there were Jews living in Spain since the Roman period. Some of them came from France, from like Occitania, right, like southern France. Some of them already had lived in the port cities, like Cadiz. stuff like that. So we already, and because we also see it in Portugal, right, which is not in the Mediterranean. It's technically in Atlantic coast country, but because it has those important ports, we do know that like in a lot of port cities, Roman ports, that even prior to what happened in Jerusalem back 2,000 years ago, even prior to that, there already was a community of Jews living in Rome, right? In Rome, the city, but also that later spread out and moved to other places. Because the Italki Yehudim, right? They are their own thing, and they are a Jewish community that is pre-diaspora. Yeah, in Carthage too, and that area of Spain, right? That was part of Carthage, right? Was not as severely depopulated as it was in the area around what is now Tunis, for example. Um,
Make you a fascist. Evola was very critical of fascism. What he preaches is not this kind of, strict racial hierarchy, killing everyone you disagree with and elevating. He would fundamentally take issue with the idea that the worst of, the white race is better than the best of any other race. He would take fundamental issue in that because each culture is fundamentally separate. It should stay that way. Different cultures are
like this here, right, is Franco. Uh, what do you mean, Franco? Like, sorry, I don't know what you mean in context to what he's saying, or the Italian whose name I'm not gonna try to type, Mussolini. Well, Franco was in Spain. Um, so the expulsion act, right, the Alhambra decree, um, which interestingly enough, I've mentioned this on stream before, um, was was signed the day before Christopher Columbus set off for the Americas, right? Um, it wasn't rescinded until like the 70s, 1970s, right? Like 1978 or something like that, I want to say. I don't know the exact date, but yeah, it's something like that. So that was there. However, that does not mean that Jewish people did not live in Spain, right? Either after during the the Inquisition also wasn't shut down until way later, but um, I mean technically it still exists as well. What is the Holy Office still exists, not necessarily the Inquisition as we know it, or as historically, but in Spain, like there were Jewish people that lived there, either that returned, well, another thing too is when Spain conquered, like colonized territories, right, that were part of like Algeria, right, like in Oran or in northern Morocco, like they didn't. Same thing in Italy too. They didn't the Expulsion Act didn't extend to those territories either, as well, I should say. So yeah, he is talking about the beginning of fascism because it's talking about Evola, but he's trying to say that Evola critiqued fascism, but Evola critiqued fascism from the right. In fact, his book is titled, the book that says fascism is Fascism Viewed from the Right, because he thought fascism was too progressive. I mean, that's literally how he words it. That it's too obsessed with with being progressive, right? Um, and so he takes issue with that, right? Um, yeah, I know. So that's why, like, what he's saying right here is him lying by omission, right? He's saying, oh, he critiqued fascism. He blah blah blah. What wasn't von Mises also a proto-fascist? I mean, proto. I mean, von Mises was alive during the Second World War because he was at the 1939 Walter Lippmann conference in Paris. Um, but yes, yeah. I mean, if you read um, even though he criticized fascism when he went to the U.S., well, he criticized it in a very particular way, right? Is that he didn't think that it should be the state, right, that should be doing all the things that it did, right? Like, oh, like his problem was that that the Germans, yeah, he supported the Austrian fascists before Germany annexed them because he didn't like that essentially the leader of Germany at the time, right, had decided to go back on promises, cause, like for example, he was anti Autobahn, right, when he was running to be chancellor, right. Then as soon as he won, he said, he went back on that and he said, actually, that's actually a really good idea. I mean, he didn't actually say that. Like, von Mises and another Austrian school economist that I think is perhaps much more up, like you're more likely to read his work. Yeah, the Autobahn. It's like the national like highway system in Germany. Um, it was BAHN. Yeah, correct. Autobahn, because Bahn means like street, so it's like car street, the car street. Um, well, it technically wasn't his idea, right? It wasn't his idea. The Social Democrats, the SDP, right, wanted to. Yeah, it started before Hitler. Yeah, like all of these things, many things already pre-existed before Hitler did. Like people often credit him with the German economy coming back, but actually we already know from historical evidence that it was already, like, the economy was already getting better. It just didn't help that they had the Great Depression right in the middle of when a German industrial output started rising again, right? But it's still after 1926, German industrial production surpassed British industrial production, for example, right? Which was always which is always the industrial power it was always trying to beat, right? So, or that it was always neck to neck in. So yeah, it wasn't his particular work, but I mean, there were many things that happened that he like, for example, I mean, I've mentioned this before, like even the Konzentrationslager, right? Like the concentration camps, they already pre-existed too. And I'm not even talking about the British. I'm talking about the Second Reich, right? Under the Kaiser, he did that during the massacres perpetrated against the Hereros and other people in Southwest Africa, as it was called, in German Southwest Africa, as it was called then, now known as Namibia. Like they actually because they actually went beyond that. They actually did a death camp. Like they actually did that during the Kaiser's time. So that's why people that say, "Oh, if only we had kept the Kaiser in," no, they're completely wrong. Like that whole experimentation with those things, the only difference was that with Hitler you had the industrialization, right? Like, because remember, most of the camps were built by private companies. Like people often forget that, right? That like Coop, IG Farben, blah blah blah, right? Like all these different companies, and you can read this in I mean, there are many different books that talk about this, but like Hannah Arendt talks about this. Other historians of the Holocaust mention this too, that like they sold, right? Like the ability for these companies to build these camps and then gave them workers, right? Well, Herzl went to meet with the Kaiser. I mean, he went to meet as many heads of state as he could, because remember, he also went to go meet, the Ottoman Sultan, right? Who famously told him, I would rather blah 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 instead of giving you Jerusalem, right? Um, so there's that, right? Because yes, he was anti-Semitic. That is true. You would have been hard pressed to meet anyone that wasn't anti-Semitic back at that time. Even today, I would say that that's still the case. Um, it's like during the Nazis, like during that time. You had the Zionist movement, right? Like they're the ones that invited Eichmann to go to. This is before he was, you know, before, this was when he was in government. This was when he was in power, right? With the Nazis, like when they were in power. The Jewish Agency for Israel, right? Can't remember if that's the exact one, but one of those major agencies of the time invited and paid for Eichmann to come to Jerusalem in 42 or 40, something like that, or 41 actually, to visit Palestine, right, back then, and they got caught by the British police. Oh, it was Lehi, okay, and then they, even then, they were very fringe. Yeah, I was gonna go into something. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, about Tantura, right? But I can't. It's just too much, especially for many reasons, right? But yeah, Lehi and Haya. Do I even need to bring up Moshe Dayan? You know what I mean? Anyway, I don't want to have to bring him up anymore. But I think you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, Lehi, and and the British caught him there in climbing Har Carmel, right? Mount Carmel. And then they deported him. Well, they technically deported him. Well, they deported him to Egypt, right? But yeah, that's what they did. The British caught him and deported him to Egypt. And then the next time he would go back to there would be for his trial. But yeah.
Are meant in the primordial tradition to be in certain geographical locations and have certain beliefs. This is true. Evola would not take issue with this. Evola is a traditionalist, a monarchist, one could even say a feudalist, but he is certainly anything but a fascist. And Steve Bannon is another one. But what we are seeing is that more people in the very upper strata of society are going towards traditionalism, and many right-wing youth who are very well educated, like myself, are.
Okay. Now that he said the title, or the majority of a title by Evola, and this one I think is short enough to where he maybe would have read it, or at least could have read it. The Handbook for Right-Wing Youth. He is completely lying if he's trying to say that book is not pro-fascist, right? And not even that. I will even go further to say that particular book, which is addressed, parts of it are his speeches that he gave to different people, to different groups of people, right? And it's addressed to youth, right? Is the example that he uses, right, as the highest example, right, of what people should learn from, was from the Germans, not the Italians, right? So it's like he is lying by omission, and then he's lying by being like, well, fascism, if you understand that fascism, the fascists were particularly the people in Italy, right? They're different from the Nazis, right? No, it has to do with when they had that official visit where it says it's like I know there's a commemorative coin that says Ein Nazi nach Palästina, right? It's like something like that. And apparently Moshe Dayan had to do something with that. Like I because there, and also because with the Irgun there was communication. And again, Hannah Arendt goes into this in depth, but other historians do too. Like, um, other historians of that time period, of that talk about the time period, I should say, go more in depth into this. But Hannah Arendt is a good because her book reads really quickly. But one point is that with Moshe Dayan is that he was in charge of the group that would communicate directly with like um, I forget what exactly was. I forget if it was the SA, but like one of those organizations, right? That would then go on and harm Jewish people. But essentially, it was again. This is that's more or less what it was, right? That like he colluded in that way, right? Because there also was a time as well where there were also Zionists that visited Germany. I don't think Moshe Dayan it was ever in one of those groups, but I definitely do remember that he was part of the communication between, again, I believe it's the SA and Hayelgun, um, and that was for either to get information on people and then they would give information in exchange, stuff like that. Um, so it's just things like that, and again, this would have been in like 41, 40, during that time. But I mean, even in from the 30s up until 33 up until 40. I mean, I cannot say when there was any end to it because I just don't remember off the top of my head. But I'm just trying to think of Hannah's book, and yeah, that's what it was. Is that it was direct communication about Jewish people, like them telling them about, oh well, there's this Jewish person here, blah blah blah. They have these assets and yada yada yada. So you know, uh, that's the thing. And then yeah. If you want, I can look it up later because I like now it's like I'm like, oh gosh, what was it? Because I want to remember specifically what it was, but it was something along those lines, like information. Oh yeah, but as I was saying with Evola, right, it's like he's lying. I mean, he's lying right here by saying that he didn't think that fascism was a good thing, right? Um, it's just that he thought that the Italian mode. Oh, okay. Okay. No worries. No worries. Yeah. Yeah. Some other time. I plan on doing another stream about that particular historical period soon anyway. So yeah, for sure. Make sure that you're in the Discord if you aren't already. Um, so then that way, you can know when it happens. I usually try to ask people if they want me to talk about anything, and that's a good place to do that. So. But anyway, Laila Tov, if you need to go. So yeah. So when it comes to Eva, like this is just him lying. I mean, but the fact that he said right wing youth, that's what clues me into the fact that toda is the fact that I feel like I'm almost 100% certain that he dropped most of the title here for a reason, I would say. But I could be wrong, right? I can't say I'm 100% certain, but because why bring up a title of another book where he specifically makes a distinction between fascism, right, in terms of Italy, and then National Socialism in it's like a dog microphone. What do you mean? Oh, you mean GigaChats? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Instead of a dog whistle. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Very, very. Yeah. Now I get it. I was about to say like, oh, you're talking about his microphone or my microphone? Yeah. No. No worries, Holy Lazy Duck. No. I totally get it now. But yes. Like he's trying to advertise that he knows, right? That like when he's saying, oh, well, he was against fascism, or he blah blah blah, that he's actually being like, because he actually thought that the Germans. And also, what's this thing about like, oh, I think culture should be separate. One, this is something even in 1986 in the book Racial Formation in the United States by Omi and Winnett, which is on my throne. If people ever have a couple of bucks that they can help me with, I know that I'm a history streamer, and I need and if anybody can help me in any way when it comes to getting the books I need for my research, trust me, it helps me a lot. And it's actually one of those books that I have on there is Racial Formation in the United States, by Omi and Winnett, and they talk about how racist, right, white supremacist language, right, which has always been trying to find a way to say it without saying it, right? Even back then in 1986 when it was published, started to use the term culture, right? Oh, it's not a problem with X race, it's a problem with the culture, right? Or this person's culture. That is what they were doing. I mean, this was again, this is something they've been doing forever. So for him to then use that and then be like, and I think that they should all be separate, says the person who is Anglo-Italian American, right? That that is Anglo-Italian American, right? That essentially, right, wants to, I don't even know, like it's just such a weird thing. It's like the belief that like the borders of Europe represent like the ends of any national culture. When I mean national, I mean like in terms of a people, not in terms of, right. It's just like not even true. Like just over 100 years ago, in 1880, only about 20% of people in France could speak French, right? And that is when most of the time when borders are where the powers of God fail to. Hey, like there are Americans, right? Like you say, I bet he thinks that. There are Americans that definitely think that. I mean, like there are people that act like the border wall was there since time immemorial, right? And it's like, no, that's not true. The border wall was built, the initial, like it first started to become built in 1995. So it's within many people's lifetimes that there has been a border wall. And so all of this talk about crisis and crisis and crisis has only come after, right? Like in relation to the border wall, right, is completely a false thing. Like before, and they even try to make this distinction, right, that there are people that are that they, I forget how they call it exactly, but that they run away, right, and then there are people that want to get caught, right, by border patrol, but it's like. And yet they act like American law, because of course it is treated this way, right? Is the end all be all. But under international law, right, which should supersede U.S. law, right? Saying that, oh, well, they're an economic refugee and they're a political one, right, makes no difference, right? Under international law, it doesn't matter what type of, how do you even determine that anyway, right? Well, the way how they determine that is whether or not they've essentially harassed the country, right, that they've imperialized, right, to sign something saying that actually we are a safe third nation, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, like white Americans definitely do think that that's true. And that the border is like this magical thing, right, that like, I mean, people even imagine it as a racial division. I mean, like if like as someone who is often in chat, Yosiel, I don't know if Yosiel's in chat right now, but like they noted, I believe it was Yosiel, that there are people who are white in Latin America, but as soon as they come to the United States, they're treated as though they're of a different race, right? And it's like they're still white, but again, like whiteness as exists in the United States is very different, right? And many people use the border wall as this kind of like force field, right? So to speak. But yeah, I definitely could see that. But another thing too is like, you know, if what he's saying is, you know, if it were to be believed, right, then what he would then essentially what he's saying is that anybody that is not Anglo, right, or you know whatever of the original colonizing groups of people, right, that were here in the United States, that they should leave, right, which is dumb on just on the face of it, but also that doesn't make any sense, right? Like it doesn't actually do anything, right? Same thing with Europe, like where French people happen to live now, or wherever France happens to live, happens to exist now, is just the consequence of many historical forces, not because, oh, it was God ordained that France was going to be there. Like, you know, so I don't know. It's just a really weird way of thinking of things.
We're moving towards traditionalism because, you know, really, we are the descendants of, you know, those that, you know, lived during the time of the aristocratic ideals. And that is what held society. One of the reasons they respect India so much is because it's had a system that lasted for thousands of years and only became altered and only went on this, almost stupid Western ideal of constant technological improvement. They only went on this path because of colonization. If not, they would have continued to stay in this beautifully stagnant nature. And really, that's what
That is the strangest way I've ever heard it put. Like, they would have existed in this perfectly stagnant way, because that term stagnant is not usually associated positively, right? Like that's not a positive descriptor, adjective. But another thing too is like the caste system as we understand it now is a product of colonialism. That now let me explain what I mean by that. The caste system was already very much on the outs, I should say, in more ways than one prior to British colonization. However, when the British started to colonize India, they used, right, a pre-existing system to then and reinforced it, right, and then right so and made it to what we understand now. Not that it didn't pre-exist, right? Like not that it's something that, right? I want to be very clear, right? Yeah, that they co-opted stuff, but they did it in a very particular way, right? Something like butter chicken. Well, butter chicken was technically, hello, cat. Yeah, thank you. I'm doing well. How about yourself? Technically, butter chicken. No, chicken tikka masala is Scottish food, of course. No, but they used the caste system in order, right, to give power to people, right, collaborators, right, comprador bourgeoisie, etc., right, who would help them administer their empire, right? And that is how a lot of those thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carrie Lynn. I appreciate that. And so thank you. And so by perpetuating it in this particular way, right? The way how we understand it now is through that lens, right? Like it did not have as much of a sway, right? Say at after the apogee or the height of the Mughal Empire, for example. or even the non-Muslim empires of India, right? Like even the ones that were Hindu, still were also had a decline in the usage of the ancient caste system, because it's something that like a caste society, right, is something that precedes, right, a class society. Um, and so because of that, and another thing too is that it hasn't been the same for thousands of years, right? Like initially, it only had to do with professions, and this is me using the best scholarship that talks about it from the Vedic period onward, right? That it was based on profession, right? Any racialization, any other things that has happened since then, um, but the British used it in order to cement their control of India and the rest of the subcontinent. In a similar way, there is no central form of Hinduism, but the sort of orthodox, if I could even call it that, form of not Judaism, of Hinduism, right? That kind of came about where specific people got to determine what is this and what is not, right? And who got to have, sort of this authority, was also used by the British, right? Like the Hinduism that has become, kind of standardized in India, if I could even say that, right? Because I don't remember exactly how the scholar worded it, but that essentially it is the product of the British, right, using it for colonial control, right? And that's something that happened even in my own country, like in Mexico, right, where you had the importation of La Virgen de Guadalupe, right, to take the place of our mother goddess, right, Tonatzin, who looks like, very much looks like what the Spanish then tried to tell us was, right, was the actual, doing well. Also, I saw the latest Studio Ghibli movie yesterday. It was called The Boy and the Heron. It was darker than most of their movies, but very good. Alice in Wonderland. Ooh, that sounds really good. I have been watching. What you're describing reminds me of Silence by Martin Scorsese, the whole misinterpretation of language thing. Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, yes, there is I mean, that is, like, there is a whole bunch of things that we know of, right? And when I say we, I just mean like people that happen to live in the Western world, right? Quote unquote Western world, right? If you do, or in the global North, right? That when we think of Central Asia, or when we think of India, or when we think of Mexico, or when we think of, right, other places around the world. And I would even extend this to the indigenous peoples of the Americas in general, right? But I'm speaking about, the subcontinent in this case, because he's GigaChat's talking about him. Is that people act as though what the British I did with it, and idealized it, and romanticized it, and used it for, right? Is how it always was, right? So again, this shows that, because it's the same thing that I said prior, right? That Evola imagines, and this is what I said earlier too, with the same thing with GigaChat, is that he thinks that by having a essentially medieval style feudal aristocracy, that he will get to be an aristocrat, right? That he will get to be a feudal lord. Because they will recognize him as being one of the true, right, ones. And so, Evola does the same thing, because he essentially co-opts the language of the caste system, for which he never had to live under, right, and puts himself at the top of the hierarchy, which is what colonizers always do. Right, like when the Spanish came to Mexico, right, and then tried to put themselves at with the hierarchy that existed in the Mexica lands, right, they put themselves at the top, right? Like it's not like they were subjected to the caste divisions that they had prior. No, they just put themselves at the top and then said, "Oh well, everyone lower than us, it's justified because it pre-existed," right? And that's essentially what Evala did. Like, obviously, I'm a kshatriya, right? Which are like the ruling classes, right? The kings come from the kshatriya caste, whereas the Brahmins, right, they're the priestly caste. So he puts himself in that caste himself. Not that he, you know what I mean? So like that's also what the British do, right? It's like they are the people that then begin to police something that wasn't theirs to begin with. There's no historicity to the permanence of concept. No, I mean, again, like this is why when people talk about tradition, I mean, like that's why I brought up even the idea of Catholic tradition, right? Isn't tradition, right? Like Vatican I is when papal infallibility was given. It wasn't something that the Pope had since, since Pentecost, so to speak, right? It's something that only happened in the 19th century. Same thing with the universal jurisdiction on all souls. That's something that's a 20th century concept, right? But they will push it and act as though it's always been that way. Popes have not always had papal infallibility, right? That's something that they gave themselves technically, but but yeah, but like the permanence of concepts is just like trying to say that the caste system would have otherwise have stayed exactly like it did 4,000 years ago. It completely changed over those 4,000 years, and then the one that exists now in some form is the product of the British creating it so that way they could exploit it. That's all you have.
It is. It's beautifully stagnant if we're looking at technology. But the real race, Faustian civilization, the words of Spengler, is, constantly trying to technologically progress. But in Evala's view, the more we technologically progress, the farther we stray from understanding that primordial truth. And I think that's very true. The reason why people are killing themselves and feeling so meaningless and are pretty much faceless idiots that have no real tie to their culture, the reason behind this is because they're so separated from this primordial tradition. They are so separated from nature and the natural order. Living in the natural order gives an appreciation for the ideals, because although what he might sound amoral,
like that, like what he just said right now is also a very strange thing too, right? Like the natural order, right? That people are not like part of their own culture. Like, what are you talking about? Like the idea of whiteness itself is something, and white supremacy is something that has destroyed other people's cultures, right? And then stolen from our cultures, right? And no, he's got a point. We are separated from nature, but not your nature. Well, yeah. No. I totally get that. Holy lazy duck. I totally get that because yeah, like even what people in the global north, right, especially in the United States, consider nature is also right a Western conceptualization of that. Like if you go to like the areas in Mexico that are more indigenous, like there's no concept of like, oh, that nature ends at the at my front door, right? Or oh, it doesn't start until I reach this park, right? It's like there's no end to it, right? Everything is but even that's using the language that doesn't quite encapsulate what is actually meant by that. But even the like whole thing about like the culture is like, not only have cultures always been evolving and always been changing since the dawn of humanity, but even the modern concept of cultures, right? Like of the Italians, of the French, of the British, or of the English, of the Welsh, that's a 19th century thing. Like that isn't like that does not go back. That's not a traditional thing, right? And in fact, that was a huge thing that people were against in the 19th century was the fact that the, as it was called then, the parochialism of many places across Britain, right? This is particular, right? But even across the continent, right? Essentially lost a lot of their uniqueness because instead you had a singular, right, national culture that was being created at the expense of other cultures, right? Like with the French, cat. Yeah, even as a kid, the term man-made bothered me. Are we, as people, not part of nature? Weird people think people are so special that they don't consider themselves part of nature. Yeah, exactly. Like, it's a very strange thing to but again, that comes with the history of Western thought vis-a-vis nature, right? Like the Enlightenment, right, is a big part of this, and also the Renaissance, right? Like, is this distancing from the natural world, right? Of seeing it as of us being separate from it, whereas in other places in the world that isn't the case, right? Um, but in order to function within, right, a Western paradigm, you have to think of it that way, especially with capitalism, because capitalism demands, right, that such divisions exist, right? So yeah, like what he's saying right now with the whole like, oh, like, okay, when you're talking about Americans, right, which culture, right? Because not everybody in America, not even all white people, right? If you know, have the same quote unquote culture, right? And I'm only putting it in quotes because what he's saying is he's reifying that word, right? He's turning it into a thing in itself, as if culture is something that you like that is essential to someone, right? Like, no, that's not the case. Like, he's an American, right? As much as he wants to LARP as being a medieval knight now, but also an 18th century English gentleman, as much as he wants to do that, he's still an American, right? Like this mythical, magical connection that people like to believe that they have, white people like to believe that they have, that, oh, that I'm related to Charlemagne and therefore blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, that doesn't mean anything. Like, you wanting to claim this is because you think there's something special, right? That you think that adds something to you, but it doesn't, right? It only serves to point out the fact that that again, that we're not actually talking about a culture as is actually understood by most people, right? One that is localized, one that is tied to language, one that is tied to all of these other things, right? And yet here we have someone saying that because if you're devoid from nature as such, it's like, what do you think is the, like, if someone says this and then immediately is not anti-capitalist, then I don't know what's the point. You know what I mean? Like, if you're not anti-capitalist, but you are like, oh, with nature and blah, 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 and tradition, like, you know, well, not so much tradition, but like the idea of like preserving, right, traditions, right, and things of one's culture, then the last thing you want to do is be pro-capitalism, because that's the exact opposite of what you will get with capitalism, of what we have gotten with capitalism. Like, every day, I forget what's the number, but it's some astonishing amount of languages go extinct, right? Let alone all of the things that are passed down generationally that are no longer done so, right? You know what I mean? So it's like, to say this and to act that like culture can be reduced to these like very narrow categories just doesn't make any sense, right? But it's, again, it's part of that like Western capitalistic understanding of what a culture and what culture broadly defined is. So yeah, I just,
Moral and almost, evil in some senses. It is certainly not. What he is saying is fundamentally about the natural order of nature and about the primordial tradition, and that, humans' eye towards the higher and the mystic is much more important. And really, the aristocratic ideals of almost breeding a class of higher men, and this system of, very much like the feudal system, with these, structured classes, really putting the Brahmins at the top, like the Indians, the intellectual elite, the political elite, and the military elite, and then you get to the serfs, and then at the bottom, the merchants. Right now, we live in the society.
Okay, so yeah, like not that I couldn't tell that he was anti-Semitic, but well, there you have it, right, with the last bit. But also, I've that is such a weird way to describe the caste system of India, that it's these specific elites, and then it's the serfs, and then it's a huge dog whistle for the Jewish people, right? Like, and it's obvious that's what he meant, because he had to say it in a very particular way. He didn't say, oh, blah blah blah, merchants, traders, yada yada yada. No, he said it in a very particular way. Now, it's strange because, again, he does want the feudal hierarchy to exist, but it's not natural, right? Like, because for one, he's also made videos talking about individualism, right? Like in his own sense, right? Like the whole idea of being like a gym bro and all of that stuff is, and even being an American and even being an 18th century English gentleman, right, with liberalism, is the idea of the individual, right? Which is not something that existed in primordial societies, right? Instead, everything was held in common. In fact, in the Middle Ages, what ended the Middle Ages was that land stopped being held in common through the Enclosure Acts. So what he's describing here about these elites and etc. blah 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 is like the elite aristocracy, whatever you want to call them now, is a product of exists now as a result of capitalism. It's not like they're this relic that behind their marble walls of their estates, right, somehow live in feudal times and the rest of us live in present day. That doesn't even make sense. But just and also his weird critique of Evola keeping a specific hierarchy, right? That is to say, keeping the one about the Indian subcontinent, right? The caste system there, him being upset about that, but then him wanting the European one to, the European feudal system to be brought back. It just, I don't know. That just doesn't make any sense. But I don't know. This is just such a weird framing of things, because it's denying specific historical factors, but it's exactly what right-wing people do, because they are idealists. And what I mean by that is that they think that ideas change history, right? Like, not that material conditions change history, right? So that's why it's like, well, as long as we can blah blah blah, then we will get XYZ. But that's not how things work, at all.
Controlled by the merchants, really what should be the lowest class. The noble farmer is really, I find, equal to the political and the military elite. A good farmer is worth as much as them, and society must be kept going by a small aristocratic elite that taps into this, that is responsible for bringing.
Also, him doubling down on the anti-Semitism just further proves that, traditional Catholics, and what I mean by that is the ones that are of a specific, there's already Catholic anti-Semitism, but traditional Catholics, like trad Catholics, especially, it can go from the ones that are still go to their local parish church, and are anti-Semitic, or the ones that are part of the SSPX, which is an anti-Semitic organization that, you know, has been at odds with the Vatican itself. So, you know, doubling down only makes me think that the chances of him being an SSPX member could be higher. Could be higher, but I don't know.
The primordial tradition to the masses in an understandable way, while the masses keep the aristocratic elite, they keep them comfortable, and they give them the ability to, instead of having to constantly fight for more money to keep their seat, like what capitalism does, inherently reducing the human condition. Instead of that, since the aristocracy controls the land, they can focus on, in Evil's view, fighting, mountain climbing, and just being absolute lads around.
It's always this weird, like, if the aristocracy had the chance, it would just, like, one, if they controlled the land, again, that's just ridiculous. But it's like capitalism lowers the human, like, condition. Yes, that is true, but feudalism doesn't raise it, right? Like, it doesn't raise it either. I like that's such a weird juxtaposition. But another thing too, I would say, is that it's very strange to think about, to say that capitalism debases people because then they're all fighting for money. But if the aristocracy just owned everything, as opposed to the capitalist owning everything, then somehow that would be like, what did he think happened during the Middle Ages? Like there was nothing but constant war. Like, you know what I mean? Like petty wars all the time, petty disputes over land, over whatever. Like it's just so weird to make it seem like they would be absolute lads, quote unquote, if they were just given everything. Like, if we just give them everything, then they will get to do all of the cool shit, and of course they will see the farmers, of all people, as their equals, right? Because that's totally how it worked in the Middle Ages and prior to that. And that they wouldn't be fighting over money and other such things. Like, what are you, like, I don't even know, like, capitalism was not the birth of markets nor of money, right? Like, so it's so strange to hear this, like, yes, like, they would just be, like, broing down, like, every day, and wouldn't have to work, like, they already don't have to worry about, like, capitalists don't have to worry about anything. In fact, they don't even work, right? Like they love to give themselves fancy titles, but, like CEO of this, but like, they don't work, right? Like, they don't have to. They don't even manage their own money. They don't do anything. So this whole thing, it's like capitalists already do that. Like, yeah, landlord's not a real job. Exactly. And you know who was against landlords? Adam Smith. You know what I mean? Of all people, right? But, like, this is just a ridiculous thing. Like, literally, if the aristocrats had owned everything completely, not only would they hold the people that do the dirty work as their equals, but they would just be having fun all of the time because they wouldn't do anything. Like, I don't know. I don't mean to repeat it, but I keep trying to, like, think through it. Like, what is he trying to get at? Like, what does he think they would do? Right? That, like, everybody just got along in the Middle Ages and in the classical period. Like, why do you think there were all of those wars? Why do you think that most of the famous, like, texts of, ancient writers is, like, the history of the Peloponnesian War, right? And why it's like 6,000 pages. It's not because they were just being absolute lads
around the land, wreaking havoc as they will. because that's fundamentally what advances society and what takes that primordial tradition from the clouds and brings it to the masses. And now, I'm not saying that I'm fully an adherent of this, but a lot of it I do believe. As fundamentally an anti-modernist, I agree with a lot of what he says, although I might not go as far. I think that the marriage between, reason and mysticism is another one of those fundamental marriages that make society great, in my own personal view. So I think instead of saying that the Renaissance was evil, like he does, I think the Renaissance was a good point where the classical ideals and the Faustian ideals were brought together, created a small golden age in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then led to the collapse of the Industrial Revolution. But anyhow, the real thesis of my argument is traditionalism is an important and impactful philosophy in the modern world. The first step for the traditionalists is not changing the world through political means, it is changing the minds of the elite, and so that we can gradually create the next aristocratic class for when the collapse eventually happens, and we have to form a new golden age. And like I said at the end of my last video, the golden age is coming, and if, people in my position adopt these same ideas, we can create a truly beautiful society that creates a marriage between morality and nature. Natural order will be exalted and the tradition will be tapped into through Catholicism. However, I do not think that cancels out what Evola was saying about primordial tradition, and I think other faiths certainly do tap into the same primordial tradition. I think there's a lot of beauty in what Evola and other traditionalists like René Guénon say. However, should it be taken with a grain of salt? Yes. Evola was naive, and he supported fascism wholeheartedly for a while because it was really practical for him, and he was misled by it. However, we shouldn't again, like the modern left, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we all need to ride the tiger currently because we're going down a pretty bad path. So, grab that tiger by the ears. Don't fall down the same pitfalls of Evola and falling into reactionary extremism. But keep your aristocratic soul. Keep it alive. Keep it fed. Exercise as much as you can. Read as much as you can. And I guarantee you will be one of the ones to survive the collapse. Anyhow, this has been Ezio Salenberg.
So, only somewhat related, but I sometimes I think about how the world could have been if humans weren't constantly at war, destroying people, land and knowledge. What if the Library of Alexandria, for example? I mean, many other libraries too. There's so much, right? Like, we just don't know. Honestly, we just cannot imagine. I know. I'm so glad we're done. But just on that last bit, it's funny because he is saying, like, see, you can be part of the aristocracy too. For 20 payments of $19.99. Well, okay, maybe not exactly that, but it is like, as long as you're a Giga Chad like me, then you are part of the elect, right? Like, you will get to be part of the new aristocracy. Which doesn't make sense, right? Because, like, he's saying that the aristocracy will be developed by, like, teaching people. So again, he's an idealist, right? In the sense of, like, liberal idealism, right? That, like, ideas will change history. But then he takes this, like, interesting, like, turn to be like, well, René Guénon, Julius Evola says that the Renaissance was, like, horrible, right? Whereas, like, where he was saying, I'm not speaking as myself when I said I just then, where he sees it, right? When he said, I see it as a small golden age, right? Which doesn't make any sense if the golden age, if the period before it was also a golden age. You know what I mean? Like you can't have golden age and then another golden age, at least in their logic, right? And another thing too is like, oh, if you survive the collapse, it's like, how long people have been saying that golden and super golden age. Yeah, literally. Because for him, right, he wants to say that that the Renaissance, right, was this unique time period, blah blah blah, but it wasn't, right? Like there were like one, a lot of the scientific advancements had already happened in the Muslim world, right? They were just, and then the thing that financed all of those statues and all of that was the colonization of the Americas and the rest of the world, that started in 1492, right? So it's like this, like, I mean, obviously he's going to avoid that, but it's like this belief that, like, well, there was this period of time where why was why was it that there were able to be academies here and blah blah blah? Why was there able to be? I mean, you can read Eric Williams's like Capitalism and Slavery, right? Like the things that slavery of indigenous peoples, um, and of black people, right? That has happened in the Americas, right? Financed by far all of these things across Europe. Let alone all of the other things, right? That were, the land that was cleared off, that was then used to then gain money off of, right, because of plantations, et cetera, right? So like if so essentially it's like if you don't think about that, if you just focus on this like idea that like one day Europeans just like decided to read Aristotle again, which again, it was preserved. Aristotle was preserved in Arabic and then was translated into Latin, and that's how Europeans read it. Um, is like it's literally taking the like old version of what people learned. Well, I would still say to some extent people learn it now, right? It's kind of like the elementary history class version of world history, right? That like, oh, and then in the Renaissance they just like rediscovered all of these things that they just had lying around, I guess. Um, and again, this goes back to my point, is that like what he considers tradition is like so contingent upon it being exactly what he wants to define it as, right? Because again, uh, like the Tridentine Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, wasn't promulgated until after 1517. So it's not traditional, right? It's not the way how Mass would have been prior to it. But it's the Mass that the SSPX uses, right? They see it as traditional, et cetera, et cetera. But another thing too is, um, well, I mean, again, one other aspect again is the fact that it's all like, again, if you can just be a Giga Chad, right, like me, just be a big special Giga Chad like me, then you will get to be part of the aristocracy because somehow reading Evola will prepare you for a societal collapse. Somehow. I don't really understand how, but somehow. I remember my teachers in school saying that the Dark Ages were only dark for Europe, the Middle East was in discovery mode. Well, I'm glad to hear that because that is more, realistic. Yeah. Uh, yeah, like I never understood. I mean, again, this is also, I mean, this is like on the level of PragerU, right? Like this is like PragerU style history, right? The like Europeans just like forgot about Aristotle, and then one day we're like, oh hey, look, we found this book. It's by Aristotle, right? Um, and then they just decided to learn it, and it's just like, no, that literally never happened. So I was thinking, so what do we think, chat, about? Should we watch an archaeology video, or should we watch? There's quite a short one. I guess we could watch. Um, that's good. Just give me one quick second to find it. Uh, because I want to actually not watch that. Oh, let's see here. There we go. Oops. Oops. Okay, there we go. Let's see here. Let's go with... Trying to find one that's... Oh, I know. Okay. So, we're gonna watch... the guy that is like founded the whole idea of like alternate history, right? Of like he like invented it as a genre, or like rather I should say alternative ancient history, right? Like, oh, the Egyptians, like the Egyptian pyramids, right? They're actually power plants and blah blah blah, and which I mean, I don't know. Maybe some people believe that in chat. I doubt it, but I would be interested to know what your argument would be for that. But
videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations. Please subscribe. If you would like to support the channel and become part of our ancient history, thousands to see. Specifically, I'm talking about the claim that there was once on Earth a fabulous advanced civilization that existed thousands of years before any of the known ones, but that it was destroyed in a cataclysm about 11 or 12,000 years ago, and civilization was forced to start all over again. Although there are other ancient history claims that pop up from time to time, this one in particular has captured the imaginations of many, and is the dominant form of alternative ancient history that you'll see out there. Have you ever wondered where this hypothesis came from? Today, I'm going to share with you that very information. It will take us back to the late 1800s, to a man known as Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, a U.S. congressman from the state of Minnesota. He's considered the father.
I always knew that there was something up with Minnesota. I don't know, just something about Minnesota. Star Wars, not really, but it would be funny if that's what the video is about. Well, there is a video that talks about comets, not exactly star. Oh, and there is one about a controversy about someone saying that there's like a hidden zodiac thing. So technically they are warring, a war of words at least, about stars. So there's that, but because there's this one guy that he's saying that like, oh look, like the Greek zodiac goes back 10,000 years or whatever, but it's not true. But yeah, definitely that's one thing that talks about the stars. But yes, like people, like one thing is that because this particular claim or this particular like story of history seems to go back a long time, right? People think that it goes back even to to like medieval or maybe even classical antiquity. Like no, like it's like the belief that there was an ancient civilization as people think of it now in the modern world, and was destroyed. They usually use the Younger Dryas period, which is a time period of like climate change, etc. Massive, like cataclysmic change, right? As being this like, oh well, it could have existed prior, but now there's no evidence for it because of what happened, right? After the Younger Dryas period. So, that's where a lot of the like claims come from, right? Like, oh, well, there was a time when the weather wasn't super like cold or hot that could maybe have sustained human beings, but human beings hadn't even like human civilization had not come to that point yet. So we know it isn't true, but it's always based off this like, oh, look at this funny shaped rock. I'm pretty sure an ancient civilization made it, right? It's always stuff like that.
Of modern alternative ancient history claims. Basically, almost all the ideas you see being bandied about go back to him. whether that be ancient aliens or the more moderate idea about Atlanteans, which is closer to what Donnelly believed. I've teamed up with 2 other YouTube channels to do a full overview of Donnelly and his claims. Technically, my video is considered the 3rd in the series. You can watch the videos in whatever order you like. But I do recommend that you head over to History with Cy, who will deal with the problems of pseudo-history and pseudo-archaeology in the world. Welcome to the Myths of Ancient History series, which is aimed at dispelling common misconceptions about the past. My name is David Miano. I'm an ancient historian and a teacher by day, and I will share with you what I've found out over the years so that you can understand a little better why historians and archaeologists say what they do about the ancient world. So this is him, Ignatius Donnelly. This is the guy that started it all. If you want to learn more about his life and times, make sure to go to the channel Ottenshey Films. Here's Andy from Ottenshey Films right now to give you a little foretaste.
Hi everybody, Ottenshey here. You know, I'm the Checkmate Lincolnites guy, which, oh geez, I just realized that'll probably be the top line of my obituary. Oof. Well, you know, it's the funny show where I dress up as the Union and Confederate soldiers and they bicker and argue about the causes of the Civil War. I might not seem like the kind of guy who would be the obvious choice to collaborate with David about Atlantis. I mean, what does American history have to do with alternative archaeology? Well, turns out a whole hell of a lot. See, Ignatius Donnelly, the author of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which is the book that kick-started the modern obsession with Atlantis, was an American politician during the Civil War and Reconstruction. In fact, he represented his state of Minnesota for 3 terms in the United States Congress. And his life and personality informed his theory.
He doesn't need to tell us he's a professor by day. I've never seen a man who looks more like a professor than an educator than him. I get that. Yeah, like he definitely has the you know, like if you were to draw him in like a cartoonish way, right? Like, and you were to say, you know, and put him with a whole bunch of different things and be like, which profession, you know, like with children, which profession, and there was to be one that said like professor or whatever, people would choose him as that one for sure, for sure. I agree.
About Atlantis much more than any archaeological evidence did. I go much deeper into his life, his career, what made him tick, all that in a companion video on my channel. So be sure to check that out. All right, David, back to you.
Thanks, Andy. So what were Donnelly's ideas that proved to be so influential? In his Atlantis book, Donnelly makes the following claims. 1. That there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a large island which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent and known to the ancient world as Atlantis. 2. That the description of this island given by Plato is not, as has been long supposed, a fable, but veritable history. 3. That Atlantis was the region where man first rose from a state of barbarism to civilization. 4. That it became in the course of ages a populous and mighty nation, from whose overflowings the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the Pacific coast of South America, the Mediterranean, the west coast of Europe and Africa, the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Caspian were populated by civilized nations. 5.
I do have to say is like, in terms of like Ignatius Donnelly, like this is a lot of things to claim, right? But and you'd think like, oh well, it must be that there is a lot of evidence, but like there isn't good evidence for any of this, right? Like this is why historians don't believe and have never said, right? But one of the most important things that sticks out was his second claim, right? Which is that it isn't a fable, which is which is how it is to be read, but that is not how many people read Atlantis, right? When it comes to the Gorgias, and also. Well, I mean, in the 2 dialogues by Plato where he talks about Atlantis, well, technically there's one where he really does talk about it. The other one he mentions it's slightly less. But the point being that it's quite easy to see that it's supposed to be a fable because there are other dialogues where stories like that are fables, right? Or they're supposed to be, you know, understood in that way. But that's the one that, like, after the fact, right, in terms of the 19th century, really becomes a big thing. Another thing too is that it also doesn't align even with the evidence at the time, So that is to say, is again, you have already different academics leading up to, right, to the publishing of the origin of the species, and also the descent of man, right, by Darwin, right, already saying this, right, like already saying that, you know, these types of narratives of trying to say that there once was a time and once was a place where blah blah blah, like, excuse me, that just, you know, doesn't even work. But what is also important is that it was also part of a, like, there in the third thesis here is something that is always part of alternative ancient history, which is always that the indigenous peoples of the global south could not have themselves, right, created these civilizations, right? This is why Atlantis dovetails so well into Aliens these days, right? Because of the fact that the aliens now do the same thing, right? Whether you want to attribute it to an ancient civilization, right, that of course can't be like any civilization in the global south, as being the ones that actually built the pyramids, that actually built the aqueducts, that actually built, you know, all of that stuff, right? It's also true that, rather, same deal with the exactly, cat. That's the same thing with that too. Is that the idea that human beings, right, first became an sort of they first speciated, right, became an independent species, Homo sapiens sapiens in Africa, right, is something that a lot of ancient alternative ancient historians have also tried to undo, right? Because, which you would think wouldn't make sense, right? Like, why do you need to undo something like that if you don't, if aliens did it, or if the Atlanteans did it? But it's because they need the Greeks, and, you know, especially the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, to somehow be special, right? And, you know, we know why that reason is, right? But not only that is the fact that also another thing too was that it populated, right, that this land, right, over the course of ages, right, as a populous and mighty nation from whose overflowings the shores of the, you know, blah blah blah, right, that like this nation is the one that essentially sent away or had all of its, in, you know, its super smart people, right, go to dropped them off in all of these different civilizations, right? And that's another way to say the indigenous people did not do it, right? So again, a lot of these theses are intermeshed in this way, right? It's always, there is no way that it is always based on a white supremacist idea that there's no way that non-white people, that non-Europeans could have built a civilization greater to anything that was an ancient civilization in Europe, right? Et cetera, right? So there's all of that.
That it was the true antediluvian world, the Garden of Eden, the Gardens of the Hesperides, the Elysian Fields, the Gardens of Alcinous, the Mesomphalos, the Olympus, the Asgard of the traditions of the ancient nations, representing a universal memory of a great land where early mankind dwelt for ages in peace and happiness. 6, that the gods and goddesses of the ancient Greeks, the Phoenicians, the Hindus, and the Scandinavians were simply the kings, queens, and heroes of Atlantis, and the acts attributed to them in mythology are a confused recollection of real historical events.
Okay, so I like the reason why the 6th part always kind of sticks out for me is because there are some, right, threads relating, right, the pantheons of the peoples that speak Indo-European languages, right? And that goes back to historically, right? However, the Phoenicians is a whole different story. Like that literally just doesn't even make sense. But because they were a great civilization, right? And by great, I just mean like important in history in general, but also one that, was the rival to Rome, really the only one that could, that really rivaled Rome in that way. Now they also want to claim but we know what the Phoenician gods are, because the modern Semitic religions, right? That is to say, the religions that now exist that come from that area, right, from the Middle East, right, are, again, looking at it from an ancient historical perspective, right, have their origins in those gods, right? Like, there is the Baal cycle, right, and it is a Canaanite, right, sort of like epic story. We watching Ancient Aliens? Not exactly. I mean, we're watching like 19th century Ancient Aliens, so yeah. Goated TV program? No, but we're almost there at this point. But like, again, like the Phoenician gods are the Canaanite ones too, because the Phoenicians are a Semitic peoples, and all that means is that they spoke a Semitic language. But also in that same way too, like their gods were the same ones that we would recognize in the Middle East at this time, such as Maut or Mut, El, right, Yah, etc., etc., right? We have all of these ones that people recognize, right, that later became something like Elohim for the Jewish people, right? Or, some people say Yahweh, right? But, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm saying. It's like, Ignatius Donnelly, right, is the guy that first started this off. Like, we're talking about the guy that first did this in the 19th century. He was a congressman in Minnesota during the Civil War and part of Reconstruction. And he's the one that like essentially brought this idea into the public consciousness, right? Because it didn't really exist prior to it, and definitely not in the way how it's existed since then, because ever since this in the 19th century, it's always just been going back to what he wrote about Atlantis, right? Because, I mean, it's kind of like what was said earlier, right, is that, Atlantis is the one that gave all of the, like, sent away all of these smart people, or aliens, right, that taught all of these civilizations that didn't know how to do them on their own, right? How to build cities, how to do all of these things, right? So it's essentially like aliens, but they're not in space. They were just a civilization that disappeared, right? But same thing. But one thing I want to get really, really quickly is the acts attributed to them in mythology are confused with recollection of historical events. This is something called euhemerism. Now, many people like to think that sometimes it's very easy to convince people, right, that, when we're talking about mythological things, that there must have been a time when such a thing was true, right? And that isn't the case, right? Like, historically speaking, that isn't true, right? Like, we understand that when, right, you have a story of a global flood or, done by a certain god, like, that doesn't mean at one point there was a global flood, right? Like, again, this is the problem with euhemerists, right, is that they say, well, every civilization, every knows has dragons, therefore dragons must have existed. right? And it's like, no, right? Like, you know what I mean? It's like very similar logical fallacy, but it's essentially like the whole idea of the confused recollection is, again, goes back to this idea that like, well, I'm special and I can interpret the sacred texts, right? And this is where, again, the ancient aliens thing and all of that starts to pop up, right? So
7. That the mythology of Egypt and Peru represented the original religion of Atlantis, which was sun worship. 8. That the oldest colony formed by the Atlanteans was probably in Egypt.
I've also heard people say that flood stories might be based off local floods. Well, like the issue is that they will often try to, like, there might be a story of a flood, right? But to say that any mythical, right, event that is described, right, like the Tower of Babel, right? It's not, you know what I mean? Like, doesn't mean that actually at one point everybody only spoke one line. You know what I mean? That's one of the things that people are trying to get at, that like, oh, when people try to live together in one place, then, then suddenly everyone, like, people have tried to use things, particularly in the Bible, right, as a way to say at one point this was true, right? Like the Garden of Eden must have existed because otherwise they couldn't have like thought it up themselves, right? And there are some people that say, well, maybe it's and it's no, it's that we cannot use the myth, right, to find the history, right? We cannot find the history through the myth, right? Is essentially what the problem with euhemerism is, right? It's like, like the story of Hercules, right? Yeah. Some stories are people trying to make sense of things they don't understand. Dragons could be example. Yeah. I mean, again, same thing with just so many things, right? Like same thing with the flood. Like another thing too is, like most, like for example, like the Greeks have a story of multiple floods, right? As opposed to one great flood, right? Which exists in the Babylonian context. But we also know that the way how Babylonians viewed floods was negatively, as opposed to in Egypt where they were viewed positively. So it's like, it's like again, it goes back to like, it's different to say, yes, there once was a flood that blah 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 did these things, which is the thing that where a lot of these ancient aliens people is like, they want to make it happen exactly as they think it should have happened, or how they think it happened according to the mythology, right? Like, oh, if the Egyptians say that once there were three-eyed people that roamed the lands to the south and west of them, then that means there must have actually been, right? And that's another thing is the idea that sun worship is like unique to either of these regions. Like it's kind of hard for me to, like, sun worship is not that uncommon throughout the world. Stories are way more complicated than that, silly people. Well, I mean, like even if they are, like, the issue is, again, when people try to say that we can discern history through myth, right? Like, that's the issue. That's euhemerism, right? It isn't saying that, oh, we can understand things about the society or whatever, the historical time period. Like, that's a different thing. But it's like when people want to say, oh, yes, like they saw this, it's very hard to. But yeah. But also, like, the whole idea of sun worship. Another thing that's strange to me is that it's only two places, right? Egypt and Peru, right? Which essentially is like the two cultures. Well, because remember, Mexico had already been invaded and half of our land stolen by the United States. So, like, the view that Anglo Americans had about Mexico was very negative. One, and I'm not even going to get into that because that's a whole can of worms. But like Peru was kind of like, was mystified to an even greater extent because of the fact like this is like prior to this is even prior to the discovery of what most people would know as Machu Picchu, right? It's the civilizations where where like the sites are completely abandoned and all of this stuff, right? But the fact that there is sun worship somehow, as if that's unique. I mean, that exists in Mexica culture, right? But obviously, you know what I mean, like, and it exists in many other cultures. It's strange to be like, but these two mythologies, the Egyptian one, which a lot of what we know about the Egyptian mythology, like, or rather what people in the 19th century knew, was through the Greeks, which isn't the best source, because the Greeks would often say, well, their god this is like our god this, or is the same god, right? And that just, yeah, exactly. Some stories where people trying to make sense of the world. Some stories speak to culture. Some stories speak to fear. Yeah, exactly. We all know this, but it's just like, yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad that yeah.
Whose civilization was a reproduction of that of the Atlantic island. 9. That the implements of the Bronze Age of Europe were derived from Atlantis. The Atlanteans were also the first manufacturers of iron. 10. That the Phoenician alphabet, parent of all the European alphabets, was derived from an Atlantis alphabet, which was also conveyed from Atlantis to the Mayas of Central America. 11. That Atlantis was the original seat of the Aryan or Indo-European family of nations, as well as of the Semitic peoples, and possibly also of the Turanian race.
You see what I mean? Like, at some point, you get stuff that's just like, one tries to explain, well, one, because of Christianity, right? It has to try to explain how, like, the Jewish people, right, somehow came to be, and how some Jewish people, right, ancient Jewish people, are seen as good, right, in their view, right, in this view. But one thing I just want to say is the Phoenician alphabet, which, yes, is the parent alphabet, if you want to say that, of the all of the alphabets of Europe, right? Well, one, it's technically an abjad, which is, I know, is just being, because like Hebrew is an abjad, Arabic is an abjad. Imperfect ones though they are, which means that it doesn't have any vowels. So there's that. So there were no vowels. That was something that was added on to the. But another thing too is, like, not all of the alphabets, or not all of the writing systems of Indo-European languages are alphabets, right? Like, there are some that we know started off as syllabaries. There were some that we know were ideogrammatic, right? We know that there were some that were, you know what I mean? So it's like these are the things where, like, this was a time when historical linguistics, right, was really becoming its own discipline. Like, this is where, like, philology, right, which is what Nietzsche was. He was a philologist, right? Is like, this is where they begin to start studying, like, the languages of India and the languages of, the subcontinent in general, but also of the Iranian plateau, etc., and coming to the conclusion that, oh, they're all related, right? And so, again, you have the problem where they're not all alike, right? So, yes, they have a common origin point, but, even that common origin point is just an academic, way of thinking through things. It's not like one day there was Indo-European, then this day there was Indo-Iranian or blah blah blah, right? Um, but also the fact that it was brought over, like I don't get how they get the Phoenician alphabet, right? Was derived from the Atlantis alphabet, which was taken to the Mayans, who didn't write using an alphabet. Right? Like people have seen like the glyphs that they use. Like they wrote hieroglyphic writing, right? At least with like the vast like so it doesn't even make any sense in that way, because if that were true, then at this time Maya would have been deciphered, which it wasn't. So that also, that just doesn't make any sense right there. But again, it's this trying to say that all of the people that are considered like important civilizations, right, are somehow all related to one another, right? It's like there's no way that they can be different from us, right? And the fact that the Atlantis was the original seat of the Aryan or Indo-European family of nations. Again, Indo-European refers to languages, right? Same thing when someone says like a German person, right, or a Germanic person. They mean someone who speaks a Germanic language. It has nothing to do with anything else. It just with their language. Same thing with an Indo-European person. When they use the term Aryan, 20th century, almost mid-century, 20th century, notwithstanding, what that means is Indo-Aryan, which is a sub-family of languages within the Indo-European family. And that is the languages of northern India. In particular, the languages that are derived from or related to Sanskrit, which is often seen as the first or the oldest one we can define as an Indo-Aryan language. But again, that's not in reference to anything about race or about anything like that. It's a reference to language alone, nothing else. So it's, I don't know. But also the Semitic peoples and the Turanian, like that's just, like that doesn't make any sense, because like it's a weird thing that in America they're trying to say like, oh yes, like they're all it's strange, because then it would mean that the Atlanteans, right, somehow are both the origin of the Jewish people, right? And I'm just going to stick with just focusing on just the Jewish people for just 1 second. And also the northern Germanic peoples. Which is like, if you would have told that to people, like after 1880, when the term anti-Semitism, like, no, I mean, not that this sentiment didn't exist before. Like, I don't know. I just, it's weird, because then it would still mean that everybody's related to one another, right? But it's still being like, oh, but then they branched off, but there's still a common origin point, like this is the problem with all of their. Oh my gosh, welcome in. Thank you so much, Hildy. Thank you so much for the raid. I appreciate it so much. Welcome in. I am Shakespeare. Yay. And I am a cultural historian. Please make sure to follow if you would like to. And of course you can. Oh, and thank you so much. Yes, thank you. Thank you for celebrating my affiliate anniversary. And for those of you that are here, please make sure to follow our good friend of the stream, Hildebeest. And like I said, I'm Shakespeare. I am a cultural historian, and I talk about history. Of course, Hildy. And right now we're talking about essentially the like ancient aliens before like aliens really became a thing. That's what we're talking about. So if you're into like, that type of stuff, like alternative ancient history, this is definitely the place for you right now. Also, please remember to refresh so that way you get counted as a viewer. And if you would like to to follow, if you would like to follow me, of course.
12. That Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature, in which the whole island sunk into the ocean with nearly all of its inhabitants. 13. That a few persons escaped in ships and on rafts and carried to the nations east and west the tidings of the appalling catastrophe, which has survived to our own time in the flood and deluge legends of the different nations of the Old and New Worlds. In his Ragnarok book, he makes these basic arguments. 1. That there is a section of the Earth's bedrock that is unstratified and contains no evidence of life, which he calls the drift. 2. The drift is evidence of a great worldwide catastrophe that occurred 12,000 years ago. 3. The catastrophe was caused by a comet impact. 4. The catastrophe destroyed an advanced civilization that caused the survivors to seek refuge in caves. 5. The myths and legends of the world confirm this theory.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Have a good dinner. Buen provecho. I'll see you soon, Hildy. So, I just have to say, like with the Ragnarok book, to me, it's always come off as like, well, like, because it's final thesis, right? That like all of the world's myths prove this, right? That there was a comet impact and that, that people had to go, hi, Sleepy. That people had to go and, go live in caves, which is like, okay. And then I also like that it's called Ragnarok because oh, no worries. But like it's just like such a strange thing, right? Like there is this unstratified part. I mean, it's almost like the hollow earth theory, right? Like this is where its origin point is, right? But I don't know. Like I have to say, like it's like going over some of these things again always just stands out to me at just how ridiculous they are, at least on the face of them. Mole children, exactly. But at the same time, it's also like, but people do think that there are like people that live underneath the earth, right? The like, blah, 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 right? Like hollow earth theory, right? Or Atlantis, right? Or aliens, right? And it's like, this is like it's weird to like now be where like this is where it all started, and actually it's all three at the same time. I need to eat dinner. I'll try to be funny while I'm microwaving food. Okay, for sure.
Let's consider how he reasons these things out. Donnelly claims that one reason for believing the tale found in Plato is that it is realistic. There are in Plato's narrative no marvels, no myths, no tales of gods, gorgons, hobgoblins, or giants. It is a plain and reasonable history of a people who built temples, ships, and canals, who lived by agriculture and commerce, who, in pursuit of trade, reached out to all the countries around them. While it is true that no fantastical beings are found in the tale, there are indeed fantastical elements. You see, at the time that the story is set, 9,000 years before Socrates, the type of technology Critias describes is completely anachronistic. The tech and culture in the description is that of the present, that is, at the time of writing.
Yeah, like so again, so cat like if you're still in chat, like this is what I mean by like a euhemerist view of history, right? That it's like, well, obviously they're just normal people, right? Like there's there's no like, this is just describing the way how people did things back then. When it's like, again, like as is noted here, the technology that is described in Critias, right? In the Critias, right? By Critias, is technology that existed in 5th century BCE Greece, right? Like it didn't precede, right? That era of time, right? It definitely didn't exist 9,000 years before Socrates, which would make it essentially Well, now it would make it 12,000 years ago, right? More or less. So, they did not have, like, it would be like saying, oh, there is this place that 9,000 years ago existed, and it had Teslas, right? And it had airplanes, and it had, all of this stuff, right? Like, that's how the story is, right? But because it's already in the ancient past, reading it now, yeah.
It would be similar to a story about George Washington having an iPhone and flying in a plane. The story says that Athens existed at the time of Atlantis, and we know for a certainty from archaeology that is not true. So it's not a reasonable history, as Donnelly claims. Neither is there any evidence on the face of this history that Plato sought to convey in it a moral or political lesson in the guise of a fable, as did Bacon in the New Atlantis and More in the Kingdom of Nowhere. There is no ideal republic delineated here. This is contradicted by the content of the story and the story itself. It indeed is described as a representative society, but not for good.
I think it's hilarious for him to argue this, to say it's not supposed to be a fictional society like the ones that are based on, like, the not like the two most famous texts that are based on it, right? That take the, like, New Atlantis, and as we before it was called the Kingdom of Nowhere. Now it's called Utopia, right? Now it's Sir Thomas More's Utopia, right? But it's like literally being like, oh hey, yeah, those stories are completely fake news completely. But the original, though, like, that one was not meant to be taken as like a fable or in a, some kind of parable or something. No. That was just like telling you how it is 9,000 years after it happened, of course.
Athens is the ideal one, and Atlantis is most certainly being used here to teach a lesson. Donnelly is suggesting that the statements made about Atlantis in Plato's works, the Critias and the Timaeus, were believed by Plato himself. I guess the first issue to tackle is whether those books are written as fiction or nonfiction. For those unfamiliar, all of Plato's works are in dialogue form, where various persons have philosophical conversations. The protagonist in these works is usually Socrates. So we should ask, did Socrates actually have these conversations in real life? In order for these conversations to be nonfiction, we would have to make a few assumptions. First, that Plato was present when these conversations took place. Second, Plato recorded all the conversations in writing as they were taking place. And third, Plato was not an original thinker, but merely a reporter. All three of these would need to be true, and if even one of them were false, then we cannot assume the conversations are factual. For one, Plato does not engage in any of these conversations, and in fact does not claim to have been present at any of them. Second, he makes no claim to have recorded them as they were happening, or that anyone else was. Third, if Plato is to be reduced to a mere reporter, then we can no longer claim that he was a philosopher in his own right, but instead have to attribute all of his ideas to Socrates.
I mean, whether or not Plato was a philosopher is, definitely one of those things that is like still to this day, gets a lot of ink printed on academic paper, which I'm still like, why? Why are we still arguing this point? It doesn't really matter. But yes, in order for this to have been true, Plato would have had to have been there, which he never says that he was. In fact, someone else comes to Socrates and tells him, like, oh, blah blah blah, like, let me tell you about this, in the Timaeus. Whereas, again, Plato is not a character in the dialogue. He doesn't say he was ever there. He doesn't say that anybody recorded. Like, he doesn't say, this is the dialogue as was told to me by blah, blah, blah. So, and because all of his works are written in the same way, that is to say, in dialogues, right? That would mean everything that he wrote would be him just writing something down, right? Like, surely that would make one question. But even going back to the previous point, like, then the other people that used his ideas for a philosophical purpose, not thinking that it described an actual ancient society, but usually using it as a critique of their contemporary society. Just, I don't know. Yeah.
Since the ancients all spoke of Plato as an original thinker, we know that Plato's own audience believed Plato to have been the inventor of these philosophical dialogues. Therefore, Plato's writings cannot be considered non-fiction and must be acknowledged as fiction. But I should add that even if I'm wrong, and the conversations actually did happen, all that would mean is that Critias spoke of Atlantis, and not that Plato spoke of Atlantis. Remember, if Plato is only a reporter, then he's not reporting what he himself said. But if Plato is an original thinker and these dialogues are fiction, then we have to admit that the information presented by the characters might not be true. Since Socrates is the character usually propounding Plato's views, he's the one whose words can be taken as representative of Plato's beliefs. But alas, it is not Socrates who speaks of Atlantis. It is Critias, a character we have no reason to believe represents Plato's views. But even if the conversation never happened, even if Plato made up this dialogue, and even if he inserted the tale in order to make a philosophical point, to teach a lesson, isn't it possible that the story of Atlantis itself was a traditional tale that had been passed down from somewhere, and Plato simply incorporated it into his work? Well, we know that Plato did sometimes incorporate traditional myths into his works, and sometimes he invented his own myths.
That's another thing to stress too, is like there's this belief that like the age of making myth, right? Of myth making, I guess, is somehow beyond us or like past us, but like people are always constructing myths and legends even now, right? Like that's just something we do. But moreover, I would say it's interesting because, again, like as I mentioned just before David mentioned, is like Socrates, who is the stand-in for Plato, is not the one who talks about Atlantis. It's Critias. Hence why that's why it's called Critias. One of the books that's talks about Atlantis is called the Critias. And the other one is the Timaeus, which is the one most people know about. He's the one that's telling of it. And even he's not telling it, like even he is not telling of it directly, right? Like he's like, what was it? Like his grandfather who traveled to Egypt went and like, or something like that. Like someone traveled to Egypt and discovered this story that was told to them really, really far away from where, like the coastal cities where most Greeks lived in Egypt. But instead, this like inland temple that we have no idea whether it existed or not, that he went there and learned of the story there. So not only do we have reason to believe, right, that this is a story that he decided to, is that the only other source for it, right, besides word of mouth, right, would have been a temple that we don't know existed. So it's by way of another myth, right? It's by way of, well, technically legend. So when things refer to the human beings, right, like Odysseus, right, like that's a legend, right? But when things refer to just the gods, that's a myth, right? Like that's the distinction, right? If it's about human beings, it's a legend. If it's about the gods, it's a myth, right? So again, it's this legend that then becomes this, you know what I mean? Like it just doesn't follow. Like it does not follow. Like, why is it that he has to go to this like temple in the middle of nowhere that we don't even know if it existed? The only reference to it is by, I believe, his grandfather, who was then told the story, then comes back to Greece, and then like 2 generations down, then tells Critias, or then Critias learns of the story. Like that just doesn't make any sense, right? Like that's like my grandfather went to Oaxaca and learned this story from this random place we don't even know if it's real, and he told me when I was a kid, because that's also part of the story, is that Critias learned this as a child, that he was told the story by his uncle as a child. So now that he's a full-grown adult, he's saying the story that was taught to him by his grandfather, who himself got it from a priest in Egypt, that Atlantis existed. So like that's what also adds onto this. Like, yes, not only did Plato create his own myths and hash out his own, add on to the myths that already pre-existed, but like even in the story itself, you would have to suspend so much belief in order for it to be true, right? So again, this is the problem I've always had with like the people that actually believe Atlantis, or at least that purport to actually, but even with a lot of other things, right? It's that it's always couched in this, well, it's this ancient source that blah blah blah, and it's like, fine, whatever, but why has no historian broached the subject in the past 9,000 years until, blah blah blah, right? You know what I mean? That is one of the big problems that when it comes to a lot of narratives that people want to do that involve history, is that they want to focus on that myth, right? They want to like, oh yeah, it's true for sure, because like it was said back then, so it was somehow more real back then, when that just doesn't, again, there's no documentation of it, and the only place where it shows up, the only place where it shows up is Plato. That's to say, like, he is the first person to have ever written about Atlantis. No one preceded him. So whatever he's describing through this character is, by extension, the first time it was ever described in writing. And we have no record of it ever being described in Egypt. So, again, that just adds on to this.
He did both. How can we tell the difference then between a myth Plato made up and a traditional myth that already existed? We can know that a myth is traditional when we have evidence for its existence outside of Plato and prior to Plato. With the Atlantis story, we don't have that. It is certainly possible that Plato heard the myth from somewhere. It's just that he's the first one to mention it that we know of. And the story is said to come from 9,000 years before his time. Why did only one person end up receiving the story? The farther back a story goes, the more opportunity it has to spread, and the more people would have heard it. And yet Plato is our earliest source, and all subsequent writers who mention it appear to have gotten it from Plato. No other myth mentions a lost continent named Atlantis that existed beyond the Straits of Gibraltar and headed an empire 9,000 years before Plato's time. But let's say it was a traditional tale, and Plato did not originate it. How old is the tale? It could very well be a lot younger than 9,000 years old. In fact, it's highly unlikely that it would be 9,000 years old by the time it reached Plato. What are the chances of any story surviving 9,000 years being spread by word of mouth and transferred from one language to another? Close to zero. Remember, the longer the time passes, the less close to the truth we get. So even if the tale preceded Plato, it's unlikely to have been 9,000 years old. It's just too far-fetched. Now, there have been some ideas about where the story could have originated if it did indeed precede Plato. Here is Sai from the History with Sai channel to offer a possible explanation.
Thanks, David. For a good part of the 5th century BC, the city of Athens was going through a period of great material prosperity as well as territorial expansion. In order to perhaps warn his fellow Athenians of the dangers of hubris, Plato told the story of the ancient civilization of Atlantis. As David just pointed out, the tale may not have originated with Plato. If so, where did it come from? There are many scholars who believe that Plato's story may have been based off legends and folktales about the decline and fall of the great Minoan civilization.
Again, this is another thing too, is like the people that actually try to say explain it from the view of, well, perhaps it existed as a story, right, that describes something that is historical, right, that over time, or that was made into a myth, right? In this case, the Bronze Age collapse, right? And the end of the Minoan civilization. That is definitely very possible, but again, like this goes back to the idea that, and it's funny because actually what David just said right now actually was almost sounded like it was completely opposite of what I had said earlier. But it wasn't. I did not mean to say, however, that reading the primary sources as such, right, or rather that the older you get to when something was first said, that somehow that means it's less reliable, right? However, my point was rather that this just came to mind because when I heard him say it, is that when people now want to say that something is true solely because of the, right, without the, oh my gosh, thank you so much, Spark That Bled. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate that. Like the people that say, I'm willing to forego all of the secondary scholarship that has happened since then because I've decided to just focus on this one story. That's what I'm referring to, right? It's like many people are willing to do this, right? Well, they will say, well, but that contradicts the original story. But again, even this, where we're talking about the decline and fall of the Minoan civilization, that is something that was contextualized, right, after Plato, right? So that's what I'm talking about, right? Like one of the things as a historian that we have to be constantly cognizant of is the fact that just like while some relation of the past, right, by like, you know, in the case of Plato or in the case of other people that talked about historical events, right, that lived closer to it, you know, many times they are our best reliable evidence for it to start, right, our investigation for things. However, you very, very seldom is that the only thing you should focus on. In fact, really, it's never, right? Secondary scholarship exists for everything in the ancient world for the most part, like everything. Like that's how we know there are no religious buildings in all of the Harappan or the Indus Valley civilization. We know that there are no we know that there were no royal buildings, that they're, you know, we know these things because of archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, right, working to try to, as opposed to, say, focusing on the story of the Mahabharata and trying to say, oh, well, we have to use just that as the proof for this, right? So that was my point. I just wanted to clarify because when I heard him say that, I'm like, I realized that I almost said something that was worded exactly the opposite.
Based on the island of Crete some 1100 years prior. Many of these scholars argue that the catalyst of this decline may have been a massive volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, better known today by the name Santorini. At that time, around 1600 BC, Thera was part of the Minoan Maritime Empire. However, the volcanic eruption caused a large part of Thera to become submerged beneath the sea. It also spawned several earthquakes, tsunamis, and clouds of volcanic ash whose effects could be felt and seen throughout the eastern Mediterranean, including on Crete. Plato's Atlantis may have been based on a distorted memory of the destruction of Thera and the eventual downfall of Minoan civilization shortly afterward. Though not 9,000 years before Plato, these events were still in the remote past, even before the Trojan War, which to the people of classical Athens was ancient history. By Plato's day, the details of such a catastrophic event would have been forgotten, and the story would have become the stuff of myth and legend. We may never truly know from where Plato's story of Atlantis came from, but it's safe to say, neither did Donnelly. Back to you, David.
Thank you, Sai.
So again, like, so I guess I'm trying to think of this with everybody here in chat, and also I just wanted to thank everybody that's here again, is that whilst there might have been some idea of the fall of Thera, right? The collapse of Thera, rather the explosion, the volcanic eruption at Thera, and the downfall of the Minoan civilization that came as a result of it, right? There are also other compounding factors that make us question, right? Other such claims. One is the uniqueness claim, right? Is that, again, because Plato is the first one to ever write about it, and then everyone else who writes about it is referencing him, there are no similar stories elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean that are like that. That's a huge thing, because the Bronze Age collapse and like everything that came along with like, again, the explosion of with the downfall of Minoan civilization was not something that only affected Greece, right? It affected other places as well, right, in the Eastern Mediterranean, since it was a maritime empire after all. So that's one of the reasons why this story of a civilization, right, that collapsed, right, in this way, in the very far past, before the story that is described in the Iliad and the Odyssey, right, before the Trojan Wars, which, again, by 5th century BCE, so 2,500 years ago, was seen as ancient, right, because that goes back to the Bronze Age, is that again, we are talking about something that happened well before places like the city of Athens was even founded, right? So before there were even people, like a discernible group of people that lived in Attica that had, so this is something that would have gone through many thousands of years, right, of change, right? Hundreds of years of change, right? Because we have 1700 BCE to 500 BCE. That's 1,200 years of this story changing every single time. And not only that, but who is telling the story, right? To then now have one specific location be given, and for one specific story to be shown, is what also complicates the uniqueness argument of it, right? That and what I mean by the uniqueness is that that we can somehow trust Plato being the originator, or rather that we can trust that this story is like it is a direct transmission, right? Because we only have a written example, that is Plato, who then afterwards is the reference for all the rest of the examples, the future ones, for this event in terms of Atlantis. But we don't have any corroborative evidence, right, historical evidence from anywhere else, even places that were much more in contact with the Minoan civilization than Attica, right? So again, that's what adds to this, right? Like that's what makes the fact that Plato is the first one to write it down, and that there are no similar stories elsewhere in the area, like in Anatolia, etc., right, in what is now modern day Turkey, right, which is much closer to Crete, is what should raise our suspicions, right? So like that's always another thing too, is like, why would a maritime empire that had all of these trade connections that preceded the building of the city of Athens and the Athenian polis, right? How is it that somehow Plato could get a more accurate story, but yet the places that they had colonies in, etc., right, and trade contact, don't have it? And when they also had writing, and even had writing before Attica, right, before the Greeks, right, in the case of like the Phoenicians, right? So these are like some of the questions that just like spark up like right away is like,
Don't forget to check out Sai's companion video to this one over on the History with Sai channel. Now, Donnelly argues that the truth of the Atlantis narrative is corroborated by other ancient writers, Proclus, Aelian, Marcellus, and Diodorus Siculus. But all of these writers lived after Plato and knew of his work. How then can they be assumed to be sources independent of Plato? They can't. Donnelly writes, "We find in Plato's narrative the names of some of the Phoenician deities among the kings of Atlantis. Where did the Greek Plato get these names if the story is a fable?" But the Greeks of Plato's time were familiar with Phoenician deities. Donnelly's view is that oral tradition is more reliable than written accounts, and therefore historians ought to give more credence to it. In primitive races, mind repeats mind for thousands of years. If a tale is told at 1,000,000 hearth fires, the probabilities are small, indeed, that any innovation at one hearth fire, however ingenious, will work its way into and modify the narration at all the rest. There is no printing press to make the thoughts of one man the thoughts of thousands. While the innovator is modifying the tale to his own satisfaction, to his immediate circle of hearers, the narrative is being repeated in its unchanged form at all the rest. The doctrine of chances is against innovation. The majority rules. When, however, a marvelous tale is told to the new generation, to the little ones sitting around with open eyes and gaping mouths, they naturally ask, where did all this occur? The narrator must satisfy this curiosity, and so he replies, on yonder mountaintop, or in yonder cave. The story has come down without its geography, and a new geography is given it. Again, an ancient word or name may have a signification in the language in which the story is told, different from that which it possessed in the original dialect. And in the effort to make the old fact and the new language harmonize, the storyteller is forced gradually to modify the narrative. And as this lingual difficulty occurs at every fireside, at every telling, an ingenious explanation comes at last to be generally accepted, and the ancient myth remains dressed in a new suit of linguistic clothes. But as a rule, simple races repeat. They do not invent.
well, I mean, just that last part, I'm just like, what is that even supposed to mean? Because like, one, what classifies as a simple as opposed to a complex one, I would suppose would be the other version of that. But another thing too is like, so with historians, we typically give most credence, by definition, to written documents. I mean, that's just how history works, like academically, right? But when there has been some importance given to oral history, right? But that's a very like contemporary thing, like. But instead, we have the opposite here, right? It's instead saying there is no way that over the 9,000 years prior. Yes, thank you so much, Igloo, and welcome in. Thank you. There is no way that, like what he's saying is there's no way over the past 9,000 years prior to Plato that the story changed in any significant way. That there was a little bit here or there that got changed over time. But in the 9,000 years since it occurred, which again would put us at 12,000 years ago, that the central narrative of the story would remain unchanged. Now, his view that every single time a story is told, that it has to be told the same is just not true. One, we know this from just our own personal experience, but we also know that even if we were to go back 2,000 years to the New Testament, right? Like the narrative of Jesus, right, of like his life was added ex post facto. It was after the Jesus movement as it existed, right? In Palestine, right? Had already been a thing. Like the by the time you get what is often called Pauline Christianity, which takes place in southern Syria and onward, that's when you start to get the narrative of like, and this is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, who blah blah blah. Like that was not there initially. The first writings we have were sayings, gospels, literally just things Jesus said. Then in between those sayings, the narrative was added, right? So in the same vein, right, we can see how perhaps there is a detail or some small bit of story that could have been transmitted more or less unchanged, although I hesitate to say even that. In my view, like over any period of time, like the longer length of time you have, there's no way you're gonna get the same thing at all. And over 9,000 years, right, of this happening in different languages, in different civilizations, in different, parts of the world, in different parts of everything, right? Like that also assumes, and this is another thing that people who kind of like Giga Chad, right, assumes that the way how people view things in one place must be how people view things everywhere else, right? Like the importance of, say, explaining in the late 19th century, right, with Ignatius Donnelly, right, like the inclusion of Peru, right, is unnecessary to Plato because the Europeans, right, have not encountered the Americas yet, right? But Ignatius Donnelly has to make it fit by adding in Peru and then making it somehow be, yes, and in fact, actually Peru is just like Egypt. It's actually more close to the original. But over the lifetime of, I mean, in science, right, when it comes to, like, for example, when it comes to things like nuclear waste, right, but other things too, right, you have the idea of a half-life, right? The half-life of any uttered thing that humans say, even within its own, dialect of its own language, and this is me thinking of language after languages became standardized, not before, is still very short, right? Like we know this, right? Like this is every game of telephone. Playing telephone over 9,000 years with the whole story that is supposed to be describing real events, when more and more of those people wouldn't have known the people to whom those events happened to, nor the place that it happened in. It just doesn't make sense that somehow there can be some central story, right, that sticks. Because by definition, central elements of the story would have to change over time. But because of geographic conditions, material conditions, etc., etc. But also saying that the power of the majority rules, as if stories that older people tell kids, or if stories older people tell, right? Like, I'm just going to use an older person, right? Presumably they would know the story better. That they would say it exactly, like, that people would remember the story, right? Like, tell us the story of Atlantis again, word for word, right? Grandpa, right? It's like, who is there to police that? No one. And another thing is, like, even saying, like, around the hearth fire and all of that stuff, it's like, that's also trying to use people's sensibilities, right? Like, yes, we can all think about telling stories around the fire. But do we remember all of those stories? Are we always telling those stories word for word again over 9,000 years? in different languages? No. Like, again, it's difficult even to say that. I mean, this is one of the reasons why. Well, I won't need to get into that, but the last part too, about the idea that, and I'm quoting here, right? That simple races repeat, they do not invent. What does that even mean? Like, I mean, I know it's more like white supremacist like thought of history, but it doesn't make any sense if you think about the fact that, I mean, that almost sounds like Ben Shapiro, right? Like, that literally sounds like a Ben Shapiro talking point where he says, like, well, you know, like in other civilizations besides Western civilization, as he likes to say, and include himself as being part of it, they only did like things to better farming, but nothing else for thousands of years. But in Western civilization, that's the only place where you ever got XYZ, right? And obviously that's untrue. But like that's what this sounds like, right? Like essentially Ben Shapiro is getting this talking point from Ignatius Donnelly, which I don't even know. Just
Related groups. Whereas with
also like this claim, and I just want to stick to it just for one quick second. And chat, like, let me know how everybody's doing. Let me know if people are okay with the video or they want to move on to something else. Let me know. But I do want to note one thing, is that in order for Ignatius Loyola Donnelly to hold this belief that the oral tradition historically is more true than the written one, then what does that say about the Bible, both the Jewish and the Christian one? That would mean that there is more reason to suspect that the Bible has changed, which it has, of course, we know this, over the years, right? Than if people would have just memorized it and recited it. Like, you know what I mean? Like think about that. Like, think about the entire Bible, right? Both the Jewish one and the Christian one together, right? Imagine memorizing all of that and having to repeat it over and over and over again, right? If you were to use this as an argument, what Donnelly is saying, then that would mean that something like the Bible, literally, like it literally means the book in Greek, Biblios, right, would be the thing that we would have to suspect the most, because everything about it is written. Whereas just some oral tradition, right? And when I say just some oral tradition, is because I'm going to say just some oral tradition that was, constructed a week ago, right, by, people at the University of Exeter, right, or whatever. Somehow that would have more reliability than the entire text of the Jewish and Christian Bibles, at least using his logic. Obviously, I'm not going to compare them in that way, right? This is just for rhetoric's sake. But it is a strange thing for a devout Christian to say, right? Because it's not like the Bible was transmitted orally, right? Like the Christian one, right? It's the most important thing about it was that it was written down as quickly as possible, or at least that's what Christians believe, right? Like that it was written down essentially as it was happening, more or less. When we know, of course, that is not the case, but again, that's a different point. But it just seems so strange to me to argue that, right? Like, oh, well, but of course, except in my case, right? It's always, except for things that are important to Europeans or to modern Europeans, right? I don't know, that's just such a weird point to focus in on. Um, that just because it's an oral tradition, therefore it makes it more reliable. Because that is not how, because it's only about that one specific, it's only about this one specific story, right? Like the people that are like ancient aliens and like alternate ancient history types, they only value oral history when it comes to these topics. They never value oral history when it comes to talking about the dispossession of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, when it comes to knowledges of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, of the peoples of Africa, of the people, you know what I mean? Like, it's only when it's this special category of thing, right? So that's why I guess it sticks out to me a bit more.
There is in written transmission of copying. Literally from
Right, which is true. Which is why, again, like with his with as a historian, and if you know, we typically deal with written texts because of the fact. I mean, I don't like to think of it as being frozen, but I get what he's getting at, right? That it's like now we have something that is, um, like something that it can be referred to, right? I always like to think of it as something palpable, right? Like now we have something that we can feel, right? When something is written. Um, Excuse me, not so much frozen in time, but like now it can be felt, right? Like now it can be approached. Now it can be. Whereas again, this isn't to diminish oral history at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm uh, worked with oral history and am a big proponent of it. Uh, but when we're talking about myth, right, like this is the issue that we get, right? And this is where euhemerists tend to, this is why euhemerists try to choose, right, the specific stories that they want to have, right, be represented in what they're saying, right? So whilst there are errors that can happen while someone is copying, which is true, we know this because but we can also look at the different manuscripts throughout time and look at where those changes occurred, right? Like the reason why we know that there is such a change in the language between the King James Bible, right, and the Septuagint is because there are editions of the translations of the Bible between the Septuagint's translation in Alexandria and the King James Bible in England, right? Like we know that both of those things are referencing the same. Well, perhaps I should use a more the Vulgate, right? Because that's both Jewish and Christian Bibles together, right? So the Latin Vulgate by Saint Jerome, right, translated by Saint Jerome, right? We have extant copies of the Vulgate, right? And obviously there were edits, there were all these changes, you know, that were made about specific, you know, whatever. But we can see those changes occur over time, right? That's why we can see, I don't want to say show, but we can see, right, the lineage, I guess is one way of thinking of it, of texts that are related to one another, right? Like when he talks, like when David brings up the clay tablet, yes, like the reason why we can say that a translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh is more or less relating it as is because we have the clay tablet, although it's broken, right? It's not a complete tablet, but we do have it, right, actually as a physical object that we can refer to. Whereas with something that is transmitted only orally, right, over such a long period of time, which is the difference here, right? It's not just stuff being transmitted orally. It's over such a long time, right, where there's no reference, right? Like with the oral history projects that I worked with, one of the biggest things is documenting it, right? Getting it recorded, right? Still keeping it oral so people can hear it, right? It's auricular, I guess, in that sense. And you can hear the people saying it. But the whole point is, it needs to be recorded in some way. In a similar fashion, so too, when it comes to these issues, right? So Ignatius Donnelly instead is saying we should value the story, and not only as it's been passed down to Plato, but also as the past 2,500 years up to Donnelly have also passed it down, right? Because, well, to an extent anyway, because everything that happened since Donnelly to now has almost kind of been without the need of Plato. At least I would argue, right? Like when most people think about Atlantis, people don't necessarily think about Plato's story. In fact, a lot of people don't even realize Plato's the first one to write it down. They think it's like some 20th century, 19th century thing. That's because of Ignatius Donnelly. Because of his book, right, Atlantis, the antediluvian civilization. But again, because we can refer to the story in the Timaeus, right, we know when Thomas More writes his own Atlantean story, right, with Utopia, or the New Atlantis by Bacon, right, that we can refer to the original, so to speak, and be able to see, right, what changes were made, right, both temporally and thematically and generically, let's say. But with something like a myth that's been told over 9,000 years, or at least assuming that the timeline that Plato gives is true, there's no way to corroborate that, right? Like, there's no way to make sure that you're the person being told the fake story, right? Like, just being told, oh, well, it's been told for 9,000 years and it's remained relatively unchanged. I mean, how do we know, right? Like, that is the difference, right? That is why documenting even oral history now is so important, right? Is precisely because we understand that people can, from minor to even major errors, because people get things wrong. I mean, we're only human, right? I mean, this even happens when it comes to witness testimony, right? Now, some people use that and try to be like, oh, therefore we shouldn't have any witness. No, that's not what people are saying. It's that if people make some mistakes, it's understandable, right? It's different if they just lie, right? Those are two different things, right? Getting something wrong and lying are two different things, right? Because there's actually this, I was going to do a stream about this, but I think that the topic is too much of a hot button because it involves, Israel, Palestine. But there was this master's thesis that was written in I want to say in the early 2000s, and it was about an event, a very violent event that occurred in the Arab village. When I say this, I just mean Palestinian village of Tantuha, which has since been built over by two Israeli settlements. But regardless, the historian that did his master's thesis, Teddy Katz, he, under the advisement of his committee, and particularly his committee chair, had understood that him collecting testimony, right, and recording it on cassette tape, interestingly enough. I mean, again, this was a while ago, of people saying about what happened, which, I mean, back then in 2000, let's say it was 2003, right? Or let's say it was 2000, right? Something that happened in 1948, right? The people then were adults, or, at least, grown children, right? Like somewhat of some 10 years old or more, right? Means that they've lived a full life, right? It's not that it's not asking someone to remember something that happened the day before, right? It's asking someone to remember something that happened 60 years ago. In their case, and 80 years ago, almost at this point for us. Well, technically 75, but I think you get my point. And there's this one professor who helped in the expunging of his master's thesis from his own university's library, which is, like, I'm telling you this right now, chat, that never happens. Once you've done, and also he got the highest grade you can get on a master's thesis. Like essentially he got an A+, and then afterwards they're like, actually, we're gonna not let anybody read it because of the fact that the testimony he had recorded, right? So the one of the professors that they interview for the documentary on this subject, which I highly recommend, although it does leave, I mean, by definition, it's a documentary, it can't show everything, but it shows a good amount. But there's a lot that it doesn't show. Like, there's also an article by Ilan Pappé, actually, who wrote about this years ago, when closer to when it happened, when there was a controversy in Israel over it. And he was like, Teddy was brought on the news and everything. Noted that he knew, right, the issues that come with, right, oral testimony, right, and that's something that he wrote about, and that he, in his methodology section, and that's something that he and his advisors were working through, particularly him and his main advisor. But then there's this other historian, the one that sided with the members of the Haganah, right? The Haganah is one of the three organizations that later became what is now known as the IDF. His take is never believe anything that's oral, right? No oral history ever. No testimony. Like, he actually says that, no testimony. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, not everything can be written down, right? By definition, not everything is written down. But that is what he said, right? And that is among the reasons why he had no problem, saying that that he would have failed Teddy if he had the chance, and whatever, right? Essentially, to say that you can discount all of the testimony, right? So even with a master's thesis written in the 21st century, has to take into account the challenges of eyewitness testimony. The way how this relates then to past mythological stories, again, should raise the alarm, right, for us. Because in that case, obviously Yoav Kelber has his own reasons why he's the way he is. I'm not going to go into that. I can't, frankly. But again, it's to impeach the testimony, right? Which, again, I can't go into in detail. But if you watch the documentary, you can see why he's the way that he is being that way. Now, why isn't this so anyway, one of my points is being here is like the difference is that that's talking about eyewitness testimony. And if we're questioning eyewitness testimony that came from 1948 from people that were there, right? People that were alive at the time. You know, imagine the amount of scrutiny you would have to put for something that goes back 12,000 years, right? Or at least 9,000 years before it gets written down by one person, and to whom there is no other story that is like it, and for whom all references to a similar event are all references to the original writer, not to anything prior. Like, had we found evidence of the Atlantis story being talked about in, ancient Iberia, that would have been different. But we haven't found it anywhere else. It only exists for the first time in Plato's The Timaeus and Critias. So that's another reason why focusing on the text when it comes to things that are much older is what historians focus on, right? Like, that's what we have to focus on, something that is palpable, right? It's different when we're talking about eyewitness testimony, as with Tantua, because the palpable thing there is the human being that was there personally, right? With something that's just a story, right? That's just a myth. We don't have that at all, right? We don't have anything palpable. We don't have anyone that was alive during that time. We don't have anybody that was anything, right? And so that's why I think that it would be wrong to, I don't know, like these are some of the things, like often I like to talk about like the profession, right? We'll say of being a historian, because these are a lot of the questions that we have to ask ourselves, right? We have to ask ourselves, well, if we're going to use eyewitness testimony, if we're going to use oral history, right, we have to consider what is palpable, right? What is palpable? At least that's how I put it, right? And like, again, looking at Ignatius Donnelly, right, it's different, but with the people that now try to use the Atlantis myth or aliens now, it's like it's strange because they appeal to the same sensibilities that Ignatius does, right? Like, oh, well, people have always talked about aliens, right? And then they look at different things and say they're all talking about the same thing, right? Like, oh, well, this culture describes, I mean, like and there are even stories that are just, even at the time, were not seen as true. Like the idea that Moctezuma, right, and that the Mexica, that they thought that the Spaniards were gods. Like, no, they didn't think that. They knew who they were. They had already been colonizing from 1492 to 1519. There had been Spanish people all over the damn place. You know what I mean? And like this belief that like, oh, of course they would have believed that, right? It's like, no, it's because of how it's being framed, right? But with that in mind, I think I'm going to go make myself some dinner. That way I can eat something. And we're going to raid Levelhead. So everybody, thank you all for joining me. I truly appreciate it when people are here. Make sure to get in the machine and make sure to tell Levelhead hello and that I will be there very soon. Again, thank you very much.